A single millionaire watched the young woman gardener from his window every day, until one day he made a request that changed everything. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Harold Whitman pressed his forehead against the cool glass of his study window, watching the woman below as she knelt among the roses. 48 years old, and he had never felt more like a foolish schoolboy. For 3 months, he had watched Margot Jenkins tend his gardens with a grace that made his chest tighten. Today, everything would change. Today, he would step outside his sanctuary and ask the impossible. The words burned in his throat like whiskey, words that could shatter the perfect distance he had maintained, words that could drive away the only light that had pierced his carefully constructed solitude. Harold straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and opened the door that separated his world from hers. Some requests, he knew, could not be taken back. "Margot, could I have a word with you?" The voice startled her so completely that Margot Jenkins nearly dropped her pruning shears into the prize-winning rosebush. In the 3 months since she had started working at Whitman Estate, the owner had never once approached her directly. Harold Whitman was a shadow at windows, a figure glimpsed disappearing around corners, a man who communicated exclusively through handwritten notes left on the garden shed door. She turned slowly, dirt-stained gloves still clutching the shears, and found herself face to face with her enigmatic employer. Up close, Harold Whitman was more imposing than she had imagined from her stolen glances. Tall and lean, with silver threading through dark hair that looked like he ran his hands through it too often. His grey eyes held an intensity that made her stomach flutter uncomfortably. "Of course, Mr. Whitman." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Is there something wrong with the gardens?" Harold winced slightly at the formal address. For weeks, he had practiced this conversation in his mind, but now, standing mere feet from the woman who had unknowingly become the center of his daily existence, every rehearsed word fled his memory. "Please, call me Harold." He cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting with the cuffs of his pristine white shirt. "The gardens they are beautiful. More beautiful than they have ever been." Margot felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you. I love what I do." "I can see that." The words came out softer than he intended, loaded with months of observation. "I watch you work sometimes, from my study window." The admission hung between them like morning mist, fragile and revealing. Margot felt her heart skip, unsure whether to be flattered or concerned. There had been moments when she sensed eyes on her, when the hair on the back of her neck would prickle as she bent over the flower beds. She had attributed it to imagination, to the loneliness that seemed to permeate the grand estate. "I hope that does not make you uncomfortable," Harold continued quickly, reading the uncertainty in her expression. I have never seen anyone care for living things the way you do." There was something raw in his voice, something that made Margot set down her shears entirely and give him her full attention. Harold Whitman was not just wealthy and reclusive, he was lonely. She recognized the signs because she had worn them herself for the past 2 years, ever since her husband died and left her adrift in a world that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. "It does not make me uncomfortable," she said gently. "I understand the need to find beauty wherever you can." Harold felt something in his chest loosen at her words. This was why he had been drawn to her. Beyond her obvious skill with plants and flowers, Margot Jenkins possessed a kindness that seemed to radiate from her very core, a warmth that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to admit. "I have been thinking," he began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that made him look younger than his 48 years. "This is going to sound strange, and please feel free to refuse, but I was wondering if you would consider having dinner with me." The question landed between them with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. Margot blinked, certain she had misheard. "Dinner? Not as employer and employee?" Harold clarified quickly, color rising in his cheeks. As two people who might enjoy each other's company. I realize this is highly unusual, and if you are not interested, we can pretend this conversation never happened. Your job is absolutely secure, regardless of your answer." Margot studied his face, searching for any sign of the predatory behavior she had learned to watch for in her 43 years. Instead, she saw nervousness, hope, and something that looked remarkably like vulnerability. Harold Whitman, millionaire businessman and master of this sprawling estate, was asking her on a date with all the awkward uncertainty of a teenager. "May I ask why?" she said finally. The question caught Harold off guard. He had expected either acceptance or polite refusal, not an interrogation of his motives. But as he looked into Margot's warm brown eyes, he realized she deserved honesty, because in 3 months of watching you work, you are the first person I have encountered who seems to understand that beauty requires patience and care, he said, because when you smile at a rosebush that has finally bloomed, it reminds me that joy still exists in this world. And because I have been alone in this house for so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to want to know another person. The honesty in his words hit Margot like a physical force. She had expected charm or flattery, not this raw admission of isolation. It reminded her too much of her own empty evenings, of conversations with her late husband's photograph, of the way she had thrown herself into gardening because plants, at least, responded to love and attention. "Where would we have dinner?" she asked, surprising herself. Hope flickered in Harold's eyes. "Here, if you would be comfortable with that. I could cook, or we could order something. I know it might seem strange, having dinner at your workplace, but I thought you might feel more at ease on familiar ground." It was a thoughtful gesture, one that told Margot he had considered her comfort as much as his own desires. She looked around at the gardens that had become her refuge, at the roses that knew her touch, at the man who had been watching her tend them with what she now understood was longing rather than surveillance. "All right," she heard herself say. "Yes, Harold, I would like to have dinner with you." The smile that transformed Harold's face was worth the risk she was taking. It erased years from his features and lit his grey eyes with warmth she had never seen from her glimpses of him at the windows. "Really?" "Really?" She pulled off her gardening gloves, suddenly aware of the dirt under her fingernails and the sweat staining her work shirt. "When were you thinking? Tonight?" The word came out too eager, too hopeful, and Harold immediately tried to backtrack. "Or whenever you are available, of course." "I do not want to presume—" "Tonight sounds perfect," Margot interrupted, her own smile growing. "What time?" 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, she agreed. They stood there for a moment, neither quite sure how to end this conversation that had changed everything between them. Finally, Harold stepped back, his hands finding his pockets. "I should let you get back to your work," he said. "And I should probably figure out what to cook for dinner." "Do you cook often?" Margot asked, curious about this man who lived alone in a house large enough for 20 people. Harold's sheepish grin was answer enough. "I'm about to find out." As Harold disappeared back into the house, Margot stood among the roses, trying to process what had just happened. The logical part of her mind catalogued all the reasons why accepting dinner with her employer was a terrible idea. The rest of her, the part that had been dormant since Thomas died, whispered that it had been too long since anyone had looked at her the way Harold Whitman just had. She finished pruning the roses with hands that trembled slightly, her mind racing between anticipation and anxiety. What did one wear to dinner with a millionaire? What did they talk about? Her wardrobe consisted mainly of gardening clothes and a few simple dresses she wore to church and the grocery store. Nothing seemed appropriate for dining with a man who probably owned suits that cost more than her monthly salary. Inside the house, Harold was having his own crisis of confidence. He stood in his kitchen, a space designed for entertaining that he rarely used beyond making coffee and the occasional sandwich, staring at appliances that suddenly seemed foreign and intimidating. When was the last time he had cooked an actual meal for another person? When was the last time he had shared a meal with anyone at all? The answer to both questions was depressingly similar, not since Sarah had died 4 years ago. Harold forced the thought away. Sarah belonged to his past, to the man he had been before grief and guilt had driven him to this isolated estate. Tonight was about the future, about the possibility of connection he had glimpsed in Margot's gentle smile. He opened his laptop and began researching simple dinner recipes, feeling foolish but determined. How hard could it be? He had built a business empire from nothing. Surely he could manage to prepare one meal without disaster. Meanwhile, Margot had finished her workday and was standing in her small apartment above the local flower shop, staring at her reflection in the bedroom mirror, her landlady, Mrs. Peterson, had been kind enough to let her rent the space when she moved to town 2 years ago. Drawn by the promise of starting fresh somewhere, no one knew her as Poor Widow Thompson. She had chosen a simple navy dress that brought out her eyes and modest heels that would not make her tower over Harold. Her brown hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail for work, hung loose around her shoulders. At 43, she was no longer the young woman who had married Thomas at 22, but the mirror reflected someone who had survived loss and found strength in solitude. The thought of Thomas sent a familiar pang through her chest. Would he approve of what she was doing? Would he understand her need to reach towards something that felt like hope again? "You deserve to be happy, Maggie," she could almost hear him say, using the nickname only he had ever called her. "Do not let my dying be the reason you stop living." At 6:30, Margot walked through the estate gates with a bottle of wine she had purchased from the local store. Nothing expensive, but something to contribute to their meal. The evening air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of the flowers she had been tending all day. The house rose before her like something from a magazine, all golden stone and tall windows that glowed with warm light. Harold answered the door before she could knock, as if he had been watching for her arrival. He had changed from his earlier formal attire into dark slacks and a blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a look that somehow made him seem both more relaxed and more attractive. "You look beautiful," he said, the words escaping before he could censor them. "Thank you." Margot felt warmth spread through her at the sincere appreciation in his voice. "You clean up pretty well yourself." The easy exchange surprised them both. Perhaps this would not be as awkward as either had feared. "I brought wine," she offered, holding up the bottle. "Perfect. I was hoping you would not mind if we ate in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room. It felt less intimidating." Harold led her through rooms that spoke of old money and careful taste, but Margot noticed touches that revealed the man beneath the wealth: books left open on side tables, a coffee mug with a chip in the handle, a throw blanket draped carelessly over an expensive sofa. These small signs of actual living made the grand house feel more like a home. The kitchen was warm and filled with the aroma of something that smelled surprisingly good. Harold had set a small table by the window with care. Cloth napkins, real flowers from her own garden arrangements, candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "What are we having?" Margot asked, impressed despite herself. "Chicken masala," Harold replied, pride and nervousness warring in his voice. "I may have watched 17 different YouTube videos to learn how to make it." His honesty made her laugh, a genuine sound that filled the kitchen with warmth. 17, I am honored. I wanted it to be perfect, he admitted, then caught himself. Not that I expect perfection, I just... Harold! Margot interrupted gently. Relax. I am here because I want to be here. You do not have to prove anything to me. Something in his shoulders eased at her words. He poured wine for both of them, his hands steadier now, and raised his glass. To new beginnings, he said. To taking chances, she countered. They clinked glasses, and Margot was surprised by how natural it felt to be sitting in Harold Whitman's kitchen, sharing wine and easy conversation. The food, when he served it, was actually quite good. Perhaps not restaurant quality, but made with care and attention that seasoned it better than any professional preparation could have. So tell me about yourself, Harold said as they ate. I know you are an excellent gardener, but what else should I know about Margot Jenkins? It was a simple question, but one that opened doors Margot had kept carefully closed for 2 years. She found herself talking about her love of growing things, her childhood on her grandmother's farm, her late husband's battle with cancer, and her decision to start over in a new place where memories could not ambush her around every corner. Harold listened with an attention that was both flattering and unnerving. When was the last time someone had hung on her words this way, as if what she had to say truly mattered? Your turn, she said eventually. What should I know about Harold Whitman, beyond the fact that he makes excellent chicken marsala and lives in a house big enough for a small village? Harold's smile faltered slightly, and Margot wondered if she had pushed too hard too fast. But after a moment, he began to speak, his voice quiet but steady. I used to be married, he said. Sarah died 4 years ago. Cancer, like your husband. I thought if I moved here, away from everything that reminded me of her, the pain would be easier to bear. And was it? Margot asked softly. Harold met her eyes across the small table. Until recently, I thought isolation was the same thing as healing. I'm beginning to understand I was wrong. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they were ready to cross. Margot set down her fork, studying Harold's face in the candlelight. She recognized the expression, the careful control that barely contained years of accumulated grief. How long were you married? She asked. 15 years. We met in college. Harold's fingers traced the rim of his wine glass. Sarah was studying art history. She used to say that beauty was meant to be shared, never hoarded. I think she would have loved what you have done with the gardens. The mention of his late wife loving her work sent an unexpected pang through Margot. Was that what this was about? Was she simply a living reminder of the woman he had lost? Harold, she began carefully, I need to ask you something, and I hope you will be honest with me. He straightened, sensing the shift in her tone. Of course. When you look at me, when you watch me in the gardens, are you seeing me, or are you seeing her? The question hit Harold like a physical blow. He set down his wine glass with enough force that liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the white tablecloth. For a moment he could not speak, could not even breathe properly. He started, then stopped. The easy lie would be to reassure her, to say of course he saw her, and only her. But Margot deserved better than convenient fiction. At first, maybe there were similarities, the way you both found joy in growing things, the gentleness. But Margot, if you think I invited you here tonight as some kind of substitute for my dead wife, you are wrong. Then why? Her voice was steady, but Harold could see the vulnerability in her eyes. Why me? Why now? Harold pushed back from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens that glowed silver in the moonlight. When he spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. Because watching you work these past 3 months has been the first time since Sarah died that I have felt anything other than numb. Because when you smile at a flower that has finally bloomed, it reminds me that there is still beauty in this world worth paying attention to. And because last week, when you were singing while you weeded the herb garden, I realized I had forgotten what happiness sounded like." He turned back to face her, his grey eyes intense in the candlelight. "You are not Sarah. You could never be Sarah, and I would never want you to be. But you are alive, Margot. Vibrantly, beautifully alive. And for the first time in 4 years, being around someone who is truly living makes me want to try living again too." Margot felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his words. She had spent 2 years convinced that her capacity for love had died with Thomas, that she was destined for a life of quiet solitude, punctuated only by the satisfaction of making beautiful things grow. But sitting here with Harold, she felt stirrings of something she had thought lost forever. "I was 22 when I married Thomas," she said quietly. "He was my college sweetheart, my first love, my only love. We had 21 years together before the cancer took him. I thought that was it for me, that I had used up my allotment of love for one lifetime." She stood and moved to the window beside Harold, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "But these past 3 months, knowing you were watching me work, it changed something. I started taking more care with my appearance, started wearing the perfume that had been gathering dust on my dresser. I told myself it was silly, that a man like you could never be interested in someone like me." "Someone like you?" Harold's voice held a note of disbelief. "Margot, you are extraordinary. You have turned my neglected gardens into something magical. You work with your hands and create beauty wherever you go. You have survived loss and somehow come through it with your capacity for joy intact. What could you possibly think makes you unworthy of interest?" Margot turned to face him, and suddenly they were standing mere inches apart, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes. "I'm 43 years old," she said. "I have dirt under my fingernails more often than not. I drive a 15-year-old pickup truck and live in an apartment above a flower shop. You are Harold Whitman. You have money and education and this beautiful house. We live in different worlds." Harold reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. His touch was gentle, reverent, as if she were something precious that might break. "We live in the same world," he said softly. "We have both loved and lost. We have both been lonely. We have both been afraid to hope for something more. Money and houses and social standing, none of that matters when you are lying awake at 3 in the morning, wondering if you will ever feel whole again." The truth of his words resonated through Margot like a bell. She had been so focused on their surface differences that she had almost missed the deeper connection, the recognition of shared pain and shared hope. "What are we doing, Harold?" she whispered. "I think," he said, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her cheekbones, "we are giving ourselves permission to try again." The moment stretched between them, loaded with possibility and fear in equal measure. Then Harold stepped back, his hands falling to his sides, and Margot felt the loss of his touch like a physical ache. "I do not want to rush you," he said, "or pressure you. We can take this as slowly as you need." Margot smiled, touched by his consideration. "What if I do not want to go slowly?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implication. Harold's eyes darkened, but he made no move toward her. "What do you want, Margot?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. What did she want? Safety? Comfort? The easy solitude she had built around herself like armor? Or did she want the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of feeling alive again? "I want," she said slowly, "to stop being afraid of wanting things." Harold smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. "That sounds like a good place to start." They finished dinner with conversation that flowed as easily as the wine, sharing stories and laughter that filled the kitchen with warmth. When it came time for Margot to leave, Harold walked her to the door like a proper gentleman, but the air between them crackled with unspoken possibilities. "Thank you for tonight," Margot said as they stood on the front steps. "For the dinner, for the honesty, for taking the risk of asking me." "Thank you for saying yes," Harold replied, "for giving this a chance." "So what happens now?" she asked. Harold smiled, and in the porch light, he looked younger than his 48 years. "Now we see where this takes us." As Margot drove home, she caught herself smiling in the rearview mirror. For the first time in 2 years, she was looking forward to tomorrow. Harold woke before dawn, which was unusual for a man who typically needed 3 cups of coffee and the urgency of business calls to drag himself from bed. But this morning felt different, charged with an energy he had not experienced in years. The dinner with Margot had awakened something in him that he had thought permanently dormant: hope. He made coffee and stood at his study window, looking out at the gardens that would soon welcome her return. The memory of her laugh, the way her eyes had sparkled in the candlelight, the moment when she had allowed him to touch her face, all of it felt both vivid and dreamlike, too good to be entirely real. The rational part of his mind catalogued all the ways this could go wrong. She was his employee, which complicated things professionally. They were both carrying the weight of previous marriages, previous losses that might make it impossible to move forward cleanly. And perhaps most dangerous of all, he was already thinking about her in ways that suggested his heart was running far ahead of his better judgment. But as he watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, Harold decided that perhaps better judgment was overrated. He had spent 4 years being careful, being sensible, being safely isolated from anything that might hurt him. Last night had reminded him that avoiding pain often meant avoiding joy as well. Across town, Margot was having her own morning revelations. She had slept better than she had in months, but woke with a flutter of nerves that felt remarkably like the butterfly she remembered from her teenage years. The face in her bathroom mirror looked different somehow, brighter, more alive, as if the woman she had been before grief dimmed her colors was finally returning. As she dressed for work, Margot found herself taking extra care with her appearance. Not dramatically, she was still going to spend the day with her hands in the dirt, but she chose her newest work shirt, applied a touch of lip gloss, and left her hair down instead of pulling it back immediately. Mrs. Peterson was watering the flowers outside the shop when Margot came downstairs, and the older woman's sharp eyes missed nothing. "You look different this morning, dear," she said, with the directness of someone who had lived long enough to speak her mind. "Good different. Something happened." Margot felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I had dinner with someone last night." "Someone special?" "Maybe," Margot admitted. "It is too early to tell." Mrs. Peterson smiled, an expression that held years of accumulated wisdom about matters of the heart. "Sometimes early is the best time to tell. Before we talk ourselves out of what our hearts already know." The words stayed with Margot as she drove to the estate, her old pickup truck rumbling through the morning quiet. What did her heart know? That Harold Whitman was dangerous to her carefully constructed peace, that the way he had looked at her last night had awakened feelings she had thought buried with Thomas. That for the first time in 2 years, she was excited about something that had nothing to do with plants or flowers or the safe and solitary life she had built. She parked by the garden shed as usual, but this morning she found herself glancing toward the house, wondering if Harold was awake, if he was thinking about her the way she had been thinking about him. Harold was not just thinking about her, he was watching for her. When her truck appeared in the drive, he felt his pulse quicken like a teenager waiting for his first date to arrive. The impulse to go outside immediately and continue their conversation from the night before warred with the knowledge that she had work to do and he had no legitimate reason to interrupt her. Instead, he did what had become his habit over the past 3 months. He settled at his study window with his coffee and watched her begin her day. But this morning, the observation felt different, less like voyeurism and more like a privilege she had granted him, the right to appreciate the grace with which she moved among the flowers, the obvious love she brought to her work. Margot was acutely aware of being watched, but instead of the vague discomfort she had felt in the past, she now found the attention oddly comforting. She knew Harold was there, knew he was choosing to spend his morning appreciating what she was creating, and it added a layer of purpose to her movements. She was no longer just tending a garden, she was creating beauty for someone who valued it, someone who saw her effort and found it worthy of his time. Around 10 o'clock, her self-consciousness finally won over her professionalism. She found herself looking directly up at the study window, shading her eyes against the morning sun. Harold was there, coffee mug in hand, and when their eyes met across the distance, he raised the mug in a small salute that made her smile. The gesture was simple, almost silly, but it broke the strange tension that had been building all morning. This was Harold, the man who had spent 17 YouTube videos learning to cook chicken marsala, the man who had been honest about his loneliness and gentle with her fears. Whatever was happening between them did not have to be complicated by overthinking. Margot waved back, then returned to her work with a lighter heart. They had shared one dinner, one evening of honest conversation. There was no need to make it more dramatic than it was. But even as she told herself to keep things in perspective, she found herself humming while she worked, the same song she had been singing the day Harold mentioned it at dinner. By noon, the temperature had risen enough that Margot needed a break from the direct sun. She was drinking water in the shade of the garden shed when Harold appeared with a tray bearing a pitcher of iced tea and 2 glasses. "I thought you might be getting thirsty," he said, setting the tray on the small table she used for her tools. "Thank you." She accepted the glass he offered, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The brief contact sent a little shock through both of them, a reminder of the electricity that had sparked between them the night before. "This is perfect." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking tea and looking out at the garden that had brought them together. Finally, Harold cleared his throat. "I wanted to thank you again for last night," he said. "I know it was probably strange, having dinner with your employer." "It was strange," Margot agreed, "but good strange. I enjoyed myself more than I have in a long time. Good enough to do it again?" The question was asked lightly, but Margot could hear the uncertainty underneath. Harold Whitman, for all his success and confidence in business, was as unsure about personal relationships as she was. "Yes," she said simply, "I would like that very much." Relief flickered across Harold's features. "Tonight? Tomorrow? I do not want to seem too eager, but I also do not want to play games." Margot smiled at his honesty. "Tonight sounds perfect. But this time, let me cook for you." The offer to cook dinner caught Harold off guard. In his experience, relationships followed predictable patterns. Men pursued, women allowed themselves to be pursued. Roles were clearly defined by social expectations and financial resources. But Margot was rewriting those rules with the same quiet confidence she brought to everything else. "You want to cook for me?" he asked, as if the concept required translation. "Why do you sound so surprised? I have been feeding myself for 43 years. I think I can manage one more person." "It is not that," Harold said quickly. "I just thought, given the circumstances." "You mean, given that you are wealthy and I work for you?" There was no bitterness in her voice, just directness that cut through his stammering. "I did not mean it like that." "I know you did not." Margot set down her iced tea and turned to face him fully. "But Harold, if we are going to explore whatever this is between us, we need to establish something right now. I am not looking for someone to take care of me financially. I have been supporting myself since I was 18, and I have no intention of stopping now." The quiet strength in her voice reminded Harold why he had been drawn to her in the first place. Margot Jenkins was not impressed by his money or intimidated by his status. She valued authenticity over affluence, and she was offering him the gift of being seen for who he was, rather than what he owned. "Where would you like to cook this dinner?" he asked. "My apartment. It is small, but it is mine. And Mrs. Peterson makes the best apple pie in 3 counties. I might be able to convince her to contribute dessert." The thought of Harold Whitman in her tiny apartment above the flower shop was both thrilling and terrifying. Her living space was a far cry from his elegant estate, 2 rooms furnished with pieces she had bought second-hand, walls decorated with photographs of flowers rather than expensive art. But it was honest, and if they were going to move forward, honesty seemed like the best foundation. "What time should I be there?" Harold asked. 7. And Harold?" She touched his arm lightly, a gesture that sent warmth spreading through his chest. "Dress casually. My dining room is also my living room, and the chairs are more comfortable than formal." After Harold returned to the house, Margot found it impossible to concentrate on her work. The roses she was pruning might as well have been plastic for all the attention she was paying them. Instead, her mind raced through menu possibilities and worried about whether her small space would feel cramped rather than cozy to a man accustomed to luxury. She left work early, claiming a doctor's appointment she did not have, and spent the afternoon grocery shopping with the focused intensity of a general planning a military campaign. She settled on her grandmother's recipe for pot roast, comfort food that would fill her apartment with the kind of welcoming aromas that made any space feel like home. Mrs. Peterson, as predicted, was delighted to contribute dessert when she learned about the dinner guest. "Harold Whitman, you said?" The older woman's eyebrows rose with interest. "I wondered when someone would catch that man's attention. He has been walking around town for 3 years looking like he lost something important." "What do you mean?" "Grief has a look, dear. So does loneliness. But lately, when I have seen him at the market or the post office, there has been something different about him. Lighter. Now I know why." That evening, as Margot set her small table with her grandmother's china, not expensive, but beautiful in its simplicity, she felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that reminded her of being young. The apartment glowed with warmth from candles and the soft lamplighting she preferred to harsh overhead fixtures. The pot roast filled the air with rich, savory scents that spoke of home and comfort and care. Harold arrived precisely at 7, carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Margot spent on groceries in a month. But his nervous smile was so endearing that she could not begrudge him the gesture. He had taken her advice about dressing casually, dark jeans and a soft blue sweater that made his eyes look more blue than grey, but she could tell he was out of his comfort zone. "This is lovely," he said, looking around the small space with genuine appreciation rather than polite condescension. "It is not much, but it suits me." Margot took his jacket, hyper-aware of how his presence seemed to fill the small apartment. "Would you like some wine? I should warn you, I only have regular glasses, not proper wine glasses." "Regular glasses are perfect," Harold said, then caught himself. "I am sorry, I do not want to sound patronizing. This is the first time I have been in someone's home in years. Actual home, not just a place to live." The distinction touched Margot more than expensive wine ever could. "What makes the difference?" Harold looked around the apartment again, taking in the photographs on the walls, the books stacked on every available surface. the small touches that spoke of a life lived with intention and care. "You can feel that someone lives here," he said finally. "Really lives, not just exists. There are books with broken spines because they have been read and reread. There are photographs that mean something to you. That chair by the window has an indentation that shows it is your favorite spot. This place tells the story of who you are." Margot felt tears prick her eyes at the accuracy of his observation. "What does your house tell about you?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, considering. "That I have been hiding. From life, from connection, from anything that might hurt me. Your home is full of evidence that you engage with the world. Mine is full of evidence that I have been avoiding it." They sat down to dinner, and Margot watched Harold's face as he tasted the pot roast. The expression of genuine pleasure that crossed his features made all her afternoon anxieties worthwhile. "This is incredible," he said. "When you said you could cook, I did not expect—" He paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "I'm doing it again, are not I? Making assumptions based on circumstances rather than actually listening to what you tell me." "You are learning," Margot said with a smile. "That is what matters. Tell me about this recipe. It tastes like it has a story." "My grandmother's. She taught me to cook when I was 12, said a woman should never depend on anyone else to feed her properly. She was a practical woman, but she believed food made with love tastes different from food made from duty." "What else did she teach you?" The question opened a door to memories Margot rarely shared, stories of summers spent on her grandmother's farm, lessons about strength and independence, delivered alongside instructions for canning vegetables and tending livestock. Harold listened with the same focused attention he had given her the night before, asking questions that showed he was truly interested in understanding who she was and where she came from. As the evening progressed, Margot began to relax. Harold seemed genuinely comfortable in her small space, more at ease than he had been in his own grand kitchen. They talked about everything and nothing, favorite books, childhood memories, dreams they had abandoned and dreams they were still brave enough to pursue. By the time they reached Mrs. Peterson's apple pie, the apartment felt smaller in the best possible way. Harold had moved his chair closer to hers under the pretense of sharing the dessert, and Margot was acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his body, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way his eyes seemed to focus on her mouth when she spoke. "This pie is extraordinary," Harold said, though he had barely touched his slice. "You will have to give Mrs. Peterson my compliments." "I will. She will be thrilled. I think she has been trying to matchmake since the day I moved in." Margot set down her fork, suddenly too nervous to eat. "She has very strong opinions about people who spend too much time alone." "Smart woman." Harold's voice was softer now, intimate in the candle-lit space. "I have spent 4 years proving her point." The admission hung between them, loaded with the weight of shared solitude and the possibility of shared healing. Margot found herself studying Harold's face in the flickering light, memorizing the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the mouth that had spoken such honest words over the past 2 evenings. "Harold," she began, then lost her nerve. "What is it?" "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," she admitted. "For you to realize that this, us, is a terrible idea. For me to remember all the reasons why getting involved with my employer is the kind of mistake sensible women do not make." Harold reached across the small table and covered her hand with his. The contact sent electricity shooting through both of them, but neither pulled away. "And have you remembered all those reasons?" "Yes." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "But I am discovering that I do not care about being sensible anymore." The words seemed to release something in Harold that he had been holding carefully in check all evening. His thumb traced across her knuckles in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "I have not kissed anyone since Sarah died," he said quietly. 4 years. I thought I had forgotten how, or lost the desire entirely. But being here with you, in this beautiful home you have created, watching you move around your kitchen like some kind of domestic goddess, Margot, I cannot stop thinking about kissing you." The honesty in his words, the vulnerability of the confession, undid whatever remained of Margot's carefully constructed defenses. She had been attracted to Harold from the moment she first glimpsed him at the windows, but this raw admission of want and need, transformed attraction into something deeper and more dangerous. "Then why do you not?" she asked. Harold's grey eyes searched her face, looking for any sign of uncertainty or politeness, masquerading as desire. What he saw instead was the same want reflected back at him, the same recognition that they had moved beyond the safe territory of employer and employee into something uncharted and electric. He stood slowly, never breaking eye contact, and moved around the small table to her chair. Margot rose to meet him, and suddenly they were standing so close she could feel his breath against her forehead. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hands coming up to frame her face the way he had the night before. "I have not been sure of anything in 2 years," Margot whispered. "But I am sure of this." Harold leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, to step back, to remember all those sensible reasons why this was complicated. Instead, Margot rose on her toes to meet him halfway, and their lips finally touched in a kiss that was gentle and desperate all at once. The first contact was soft, questioning, a tentative exploration of possibility, but when Margot's hands came up to rest against Harold's chest, when she made a small sound of pleasure against his mouth, something shifted between them. Harold deepened the kiss, his arms coming around her waist to pull her closer, and Margot responded with an enthusiasm that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the intimate aftermath of that first connection. "Oh," Margot breathed, her hands still fisted in Harold's sweater. "Yes," Harold agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Definitely, oh." They stood like that for a moment, holding each other in the candle-lit kitchen, both struggling to process the intensity of what had just happened. The kiss had been more than either had expected, not just physical attraction, but recognition, connection, the sense of finding something they had not even realized they were searching for. "I should probably go," Harold said eventually, though he made no move to release her. "Probably," Margot agreed, though her arms tightened around him. Neither of them moved. The smart thing, the sensible thing would be to end the evening now, before they moved beyond kisses into territory that would complicate everything. But sensible had gotten them both 4 years and 2 years of loneliness, respectively. Perhaps it was time to try something different. "Or," Margot said carefully, "you could stay for coffee." Harold pulled back to look at her, searching her face for any sign that the offer was made out of politeness rather than genuine desire. What he saw in her brown eyes was the same mixture of nervousness and want that he felt in his own chest. "Just coffee?" he asked. "Just coffee," she confirmed, "and maybe more conversation. I am not ready for this evening to end." "Neither am I." They moved to the small sofa, sitting close enough to touch, but not quite touching, like teenagers navigating the complex etiquette of new attraction. Harold accepted the coffee Margot brought him, though his attention was entirely focused on the woman beside him rather than the beverage. "This is strange," Margot said, curling her legs under her on the sofa. "Good strange, but strange." "What part?" "All of it. 3 days ago, you were the mysterious man at the window. Now you're sitting in my living room, and I'm thinking about kissing you again." Harold set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. only thinking about it. The question was asked lightly, but Margot could hear the deeper uncertainty underneath. For all his success and confidence in other areas of his life, Harold was as unsure about this new territory as she was. "Well," she said, sliding closer to him on the sofa, "thinking is overrated." This time, when they kissed, there was no hesitation, no careful testing of boundaries. Margot melted against Harold's chest, her hands tangling in his hair, while he held her as if she were something precious and fragile and infinitely worth protecting. The kiss deepened, became hungrier, spoke of months of watching and wanting and wondering what it would be like to touch and be touched again. When they broke apart this time, Harold's sweater was rumpled and Margot's hair had escaped its careful styling, but neither seemed to care about appearances. "I should definitely go now," Harold said, his voice rough with want. "Yes," Margot agreed, then kissed him again anyway. They were in trouble, and both of them knew it. Harold did not go home that night, though they both maintained the fiction that he would until nearly midnight. Instead, they sat on Margot's small sofa, talking and kissing and discovering the peculiar magic of adult attraction, uncomplicated by youthful inexperience or the desperate urgency of first love. This was different, deeper, more intentional, weighted with the knowledge of how rare it was to find genuine connection with another person. By the time Harold finally left, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and both of them were past the point of pretending this was a casual attraction that could be easily managed or contained. "This changes things," Harold said, as they stood at Margot's door, her hand still caught in his. "Everything," she agreed. "Your job is still my job," Margot interrupted firmly. "Harold, whatever happens between us personally, I still need to work. I still need to support myself. We have to find a way to keep those parts of our lives separate." Harold nodded, though the practical complications made his head spin. How did you maintain professional boundaries with someone you had spent the night kissing? How did you pretend indifference to a woman whose laugh had become the soundtrack to your contentment? "We will figure it out," he said, though he had no idea how. "Yes," Margot said, rising on her toes to press one last soft kiss to his mouth. "We will." The next morning brought the first test of their resolve to keep personal and professional separate. Margot arrived at the estate at her usual time, determined to behave normally, despite the fact that every cell in her body was hyper-aware of Harold's presence in the house. She threw herself into her work with extra intensity, attacking a section of overgrown shrubs that had been on her to-do list for weeks. Harold, meanwhile, was discovering that watching Margot work had taken on an entirely different quality now that he knew how she felt in his arms, now that he had tasted her mouth and felt her hands in his hair. The careful distance he had maintained for months was impossible to reclaim. Every glimpse of her through the window sent heat shooting through him, and he found himself unable to concentrate on the business calls and emails that normally commanded his complete attention. By 10 o'clock, both of them were struggling. Margot had pruned the same rosebush 3 times, and Harold had read the same contract paragraph 6 times without absorbing a single word. The careful professionalism they had agreed to maintain felt artificial and unsustainable. The breaking point came when Margot bent to collect fallen branches, and Harold appeared beside her with a pair of work gloves and a determined expression. "Let me help," he said. "You do not need to. I want to." He pulled on the gloves with the air of a man making a decision. "I want to understand what you do out here, want to learn what makes you so passionate about all of this." Margot studied his face, seeing the genuine curiosity beneath the obvious desire to be close to her. "You will get dirty." "I hope so." The smile that accompanied his words made her stomach flutter, but she handed him a pair of pruning shears anyway. If Harold Whitman wanted to learn about gardening, she was certainly qualified to teach him. Start with the deadheading, she instructed, pointing to the roses that needed spent blooms removed. Cut just above the first 5-leaflet leaf at an angle that slopes away from the center of the plant. Harold followed her instructions with the careful attention he brought to everything important to him, asking questions about plant health and growing cycles that showed he was genuinely interested rather than simply looking for excuses to be near her. Margot found herself relaxing as they worked side by side, the familiar rhythm of garden tasks providing a framework for the new dynamic between them. "Why roses?" Harold asked as they moved to the next bush. "Of all the flowers you could specialize in, why these?" "They are complicated," Margot said, stripping away diseased leaves with practiced efficiency. "Beautiful but demanding. They reward attention and care, but they also forgive mistakes if you learn from them. They seem like good metaphors for most worthwhile things in life." Harold paused in his work to look at her, struck by the wisdom in her observation. "Including relationships? Especially relationships." She met his eyes across the rosebush they were sharing. "The best ones require patience and commitment and the willingness to keep trying even when things get difficult." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car in the driveway. Harold straightened, automatically moving away from Margot as a sleek black sedan pulled up to the front of the house. Even from a distance, Margot could see that the vehicle screamed money and importance. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked. Harold's expression had gone carefully neutral, the relaxed man who had been learning to deadhead roses replaced by the successful businessman she glimpsed in his more formal moments. "My business partner," he said. "Richard Carlyle. I was not expecting him, which probably means there is some crisis that requires immediate attention." A tall man in an expensive suit emerged from the sedan, his gaze immediately finding Harold among the garden beds. Even from a distance, Margot could see his surprise at finding Harold Whitman working in the dirt beside the hired help. "Harold!" Richard called, striding toward them with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "I have been trying to reach you all morning. We need to discuss the Morrison contract immediately." Harold pulled off his work gloves with deliberate care, his expression revealing nothing of the frustration Margot suspected he was feeling at the interruption. "Richard, this is Margot Jenkins, our gardener." "Margot, Richard Carlyle, my business partner." The introduction was perfectly polite and completely impersonal, offering no hint of the intimacy that had developed between them. Margot understood the necessity. Harold's business relationships were not her concern, and their personal relationship was too new and fragile to withstand outside scrutiny, but the sudden distance still stung. "Nice to meet you," she said, pulling off her own gloves. Richard acknowledged her with the kind of distracted politeness wealthy people reserved for service providers, his attention already focused entirely on Harold. "We really do need to talk," he said urgently. "The Morrison people are threatening to pull out of the deal entirely unless we can address their concerns about the environmental impact assessments." Harold nodded, his businessman facade now completely in place. "Of course. Let me wash up and we can discuss it in my study." He turned to Margot, and for just a moment, his professional mask slipped enough to reveal regret and apology. "Thank you for the gardening lesson," he said formally. "I found it very educational." The words were innocuous enough, but the look in his eyes conveyed everything he could not say in front of Richard, that he was sorry for the interruption, that he wanted to continue both the work and the conversation, that this sudden return to formal roles felt as wrong to him as it did to her. "You are a quick learner," Margot replied, matching his tone while letting her own eyes convey understanding and patience. As Harold walked toward the house with Richard, Margot heard fragments of urgent business discussion, reminders of the world Harold inhabited when he was not learning to prune roses or sitting in her small apartment sharing pot roast and confidences. It was a world that had no place for gardeners who lived above flower shops, a world where personal relationships were secondary to profit margins and contractual obligations. Standing alone among the roses they had been tending together, Margot felt the first real stirring of doubt about what they were attempting. Harold had been honest about his wealth and status, but seeing him slip so effortlessly back into that world made the distance between them feel more daunting than ever. Inside the house, Harold was struggling with his own doubts as Richard outlined the crisis that had brought him racing to the estate. But his attention kept drifting to the window, to the woman who was continuing their shared work alone, and he realized that no business emergency felt as urgent as the need to return to her side. The business meeting stretched into the afternoon, leaving Margot to finish the garden work alone, while the sound of heated discussion drifted occasionally from Harold's study. She tried to focus on her tasks, but the contrast between the intimate morning they had shared and the sudden reminder of their different social positions left her feeling unsettled and exposed. When Richard finally emerged from the house 3 hours later, his expression was grim and Harold nowhere to be seen. The businessman paused beside Margot as she watered the herb garden, his calculating gaze taking in her work clothes and dirt-stained hands with barely concealed distaste. "You have been working here long?" he asked, the question seeming casual but loaded with undertones Margot could not quite identify. 3 months, she replied carefully. "Harold seems quite taken with your work. He was describing your gardening techniques in considerable detail." Richard's smile did not reach his eyes, though I must say I was surprised to find him working alongside the staff. That is rather unusual behavior for Harold. The comment felt like a warning disguised as small talk, and Margot understood that Richard had noticed more during his brief observation than she had realized. The successful businessman who had built an empire alongside Harold was nobody's fool, and he had clearly sensed something different about his partner's interaction with the gardener. "Mr. Whitman takes an active interest in maintaining his property," Margot said diplomatically. "Yes, he does." Richard's tone suggested layers of meaning she was not privy to. "Harold has always been very particular about protecting his investments. I do hope he continues to exercise the same careful judgment he has always shown in business matters." The thinly veiled threat made Margot's stomach clench, but she kept her expression neutral. "I am sure he will." Richard nodded curtly and strode to his car, leaving Margot standing among the herbs with the distinct feeling that she had just been evaluated and found wanting. The message was clear. She was seen as a potential threat to Harold's focus and judgment, someone who needed to be watched and possibly eliminated if she became too much of a distraction. Harold appeared at her side moments after Richard's car disappeared down the drive, his face tight with frustration and something that looked like embarrassment. "I apologize for that," he said without preamble. "Richard can be intense about business matters." "What did you tell him about us?" Margot asked directly. Harold ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was learning indicated stress or uncertainty. "Nothing specific. But he noticed that I was more relaxed than usual, more distracted from work concerns. Richard has known me for 15 years. He can read my moods better than anyone. And he does not approve of whatever he thinks he detected. Richard believes that personal relationships are liabilities when it comes to business success. He has seen too many partnerships dissolve because someone got emotionally involved and lost their edge." Harold's voice carried the weight of old arguments and fundamental disagreements. "He is not wrong about the risks, but he fails to understand that some things are worth the risk." Margot appreciated Harold's honesty, but Richard's visit had highlighted complications she had been trying to ignore. Their relationship was not happening in a vacuum. It had the potential to affect Harold's business relationships, his professional reputation, and the carefully ordered life he had built since his wife's death. "Maybe he has a point," she said quietly. "Maybe we are moving too fast, complicating things unnecessarily." Harold stepped closer, his grey eyes intense in the afternoon sunlight. "Are you having second thoughts?" The question was asked quietly, but Margot could hear the vulnerability underneath. Harold was as new to this as she was, as uncertain about navigating the treacherous waters of middle-aged romance while managing the practical complications of their different circumstances. "I am having realistic thoughts," she said, "about what happens when your business associates decide I am a bad influence. About what happens to my job if this thing between us goes wrong. About whether we are being smart or just self-indulgent." Harold was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the same careful attention he brought to important business decisions. When he spoke, his voice was measured but determined. "You are right to be concerned about the practical implications. But Margot, I have spent 4 years being careful, being smart, protecting myself from any possibility of emotional risk. It has kept me safe, but it has also kept me half alive." He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers despite the possibility that someone might see them from the road or neighboring properties. "I am not asking you to ignore the complications. I'm asking you to decide whether what we have found together is worth working through them." Before Margot could respond, the sound of another vehicle in the drive made them both step apart quickly. This time, it was a familiar pickup truck that Margot recognized immediately, Mrs. Peterson's ancient Ford, driven today by the older woman's nephew, Jake, who helped with deliveries for the flower shop. "Miss Jenkins?" Jake called as he climbed out of the truck. "Aunt Ruth sent me to find you. She says there is some kind of emergency at the shop that needs your attention right away." Margot felt her heart sink. Emergencies at the flower shop usually meant broken pipes, electrical problems, or other crises that could threaten both her living space and her secondary source of income. The timing felt particularly cruel, just when she and Harold were trying to navigate the complexities Richard's visit had highlighted. "What kind of emergency?" she asked. "Something about water damage in the back room where you keep the supplies. She said it is pretty bad." Margot looked at Harold apologetically. "I have to go. If there is water damage, it could affect my apartment upstairs. And tomorrow is Saturday. We have 3 wedding arrangements that need to be completed." "Of course," Harold said immediately. "Go. Do what you need to do." "I can drive you," Jake offered. "Aunt Ruth said to bring you back as quickly as possible." Margot hesitated, caught between professional obligation and personal desire. The conversation with Harold felt unfinished, hanging at a crucial point where decisions needed to be made about their future. But Mrs. Peterson had been kind to her when she needed help most, and the flower shop provided essential supplemental income she could not afford to lose. "I will call you later," she told Harold. "When I know how serious the damage is. Or I could come by the shop," Harold suggested, "if you need help with anything." The offer was sweet, but Margot could imagine Mrs. Peterson's reaction to Harold Whitman appearing at the flower shop in the midst of a crisis. The older woman was already far too interested in Margot's personal life, and Harold's presence would provide enough gossip fuel to last months. "Let me assess the situation first," she said diplomatically. "I will let you know." As Jake's truck pulled away from the estate, Margot watched Harold grow smaller in the rear window and wondered if every step forward in their relationship would be accompanied by 2 steps backward, courtesy of outside complications. Between Richard's obvious disapproval and now this crisis at the shop, it felt like the universe was testing their resolve before they had even figured out what they were resolving to do. The flower shop emergency turned out to be as serious as Mrs. Peterson had indicated. A pipe had burst in the back room overnight, flooding the space where they stored ribbons, vases, and other essential supplies. The water had also seeped into the foundation of the building, creating concerns about structural damage that could affect Margot's apartment. "I am so sorry, dear," Mrs. Peterson said as they surveyed the soggy mess. "The plumber says it will take at least a week to dry everything out properly and assess the full extent of the damage. I'm afraid your apartment might not be habitable during the repairs." Standing ankle-deep in water-damaged flower arrangements, Margot felt the fragile optimism of the past few days crumble around her like soggy petals. The apartment that had become her sanctuary, the place where she had cooked dinner for Harold and discovered the possibility of beginning again, was now uninhabitable for an indefinite period. "Do you have somewhere you can stay?" Mrs. Peterson asked, her weathered face creased with genuine concern. Margot ran through her limited options. She had no family in the area, few close friends, and not enough savings to afford a hotel for a week or more. The closest thing she had to a support system was standing beside her in rubber boots, looking as distressed as she felt. "I will figure something out," she said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Nonsense. You will stay with me." Mrs. Peterson's tone brooked no argument. "The spare room is small, but it is clean and dry. We can make do until your place is livable again." The offer was generous and practical, but it would also mean living under the watchful eye of a woman who already suspected something was developing between Margot and Harold. Mrs. Peterson was kind but hardly discreet, and the last thing their fragile relationship needed was a well-meaning matchmaker offering commentary on every interaction. "I could not impose," Margot began. "You are not imposing. You are accepting help from someone who cares about you." Mrs. Peterson fixed her with the stern look that had probably convinced decades of customers to buy flowers they had not planned to purchase. "Besides, I could use the company. This old house gets lonely, especially in the evenings." Before Margot could formulate further protests, her phone rang. Harold's name appeared on the screen, and she felt her heart skip despite the chaos surrounding her. "How bad is it?" he asked without preamble. "Bad. The apartment is not livable for at least a week, maybe longer depending on what the structural assessment reveals." "Where will you stay?" The question was asked with careful neutrality, but Margot could hear the underlying concern. She glanced at Mrs. Peterson, who was pretending to sort through water-damaged supplies while obviously listening to every word. "Mrs. Peterson has offered her spare room," Margot said. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Margot could practically hear Harold processing the implications. Mrs. Peterson was sweet, but notorious for her involvement in other people's business. Having Margot stay with her would be like broadcasting their relationship to anyone who cared to pay attention. "That is very kind of her," Harold said finally. "But you know you have other options." The suggestion hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to voice. Harold was offering his house, his protection, his resources, but accepting would blur the professional and personal boundaries they were still trying to navigate. "Harold, I have 6 bedrooms," he continued, his voice carefully reasonable. "You could have complete privacy, your own space. And it would make the commute to work considerably shorter." Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows had risen to her hairline as she abandoned all pretense of not listening. Margot could see the older woman processing this new information with the focused attention of someone who had just received confirmation of her most interesting suspicions. "I appreciate the offer," Margot said carefully, "but I think Mrs. Peterson's arrangement will work fine." "Of course," Harold said, though she could hear disappointment in his voice. "I just want you to know that you have choices." After ending the call, Margot found herself under Mrs. Peterson's speculative gaze. The older woman was practically vibrating with curiosity, and Margot knew there was no avoiding the conversation that was coming. "Harold Whitman offered you a place to stay?" Mrs. Peterson asked with the delicacy of a freight train. "He was being kind. He has a large house." "Indeed he does, and apparently a large interest in your welfare." Mrs. Peterson's eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of someone whose matchmaking instincts had been proven correct. "How long has this been going on?" Mrs. Peterson: "Do not try to deflect, dear. I have been watching the signs for weeks. You humming while you arrange flowers, taking extra care with your appearance, that glow that comes from being appreciated by someone special. Plus, Harold has been shopping at the market more frequently, always asking casual questions about you." The revelation that Harold had been asking about her sent warmth flooding through Margot's chest, even as she tried to maintain some semblance of privacy about their developing relationship. "We have had dinner a couple of times," she admitted, and it is complicated. He is my employer. We come from very different worlds. His business partner thinks I am a distraction that could affect Harold's judgment." Mrs. Peterson snorted with derision. "Richard Carlyle is a cold fish who thinks anything that does not generate profit is a waste of time. The man has been divorced 3 times because he cannot understand that relationships require actual emotional investment." "You know Richard?" "Small town, dear. Everyone knows everyone, especially when money is involved. Richard has been trying to convince Harold to sell this property and move closer to the city for years. He sees Harold's contentment here as a threat to their business expansion plans." This was new information that reframed Richard's visit in a different light. His disapproval of Margot might have less to do with her personally and more to do with anything that made Harold want to stay in the small town rather than pursuing more aggressive business opportunities. "Harold has not mentioned selling," Margot said, "because he is finally happy here. And Richard knows that happiness makes people less willing to uproot their lives for profit margins." Mrs. Peterson began loading salvageable supplies into a dry box with brisk efficiency. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" "What do you mean?" "Are you going to let Richard Carlyle and social conventions dictate your choices? Or are you going to fight for something that makes you both happy?" The directness of the question caught Margot off guard. She had been so focused on the practical complications and potential obstacles that she had not really considered the alternative, actively choosing to pursue their relationship despite the challenges. "I do not know if I am brave enough for that kind of fight," she admitted. Mrs. Peterson stopped her sorting and fixed Margot with a look that was both gentle and fierce. "My dear girl, you packed up your entire life after your husband died and started over in a place where you knew no one. You took a job working for a reclusive millionaire and turned his neglected gardens into something magical. You survived loss and loneliness and found the strength to hope again. Trust me, you are brave enough for whatever fight is required." The older woman's words resonated through Margot like a bell, reminding her of reserves of strength she had forgotten she possessed. She had survived the worst thing she could imagine, losing Thomas, and found ways to build a meaningful life from the ashes of that loss. Perhaps it was time to stop approaching happiness so defensively. That evening, as Margot settled into Mrs. Peterson's spare room with a bag of clothes salvaged from her water-damaged apartment, she found herself thinking about choices and courage. Through the window, she could see the lights of Harold's house in the distance, and she wondered what he was doing, whether he was thinking about her, whether he was questioning the wisdom of getting involved with someone whose life seemed to attract complications. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Sweet dreams, Margot. Tomorrow we figure out how to make this work." Reading Harold's words, Margot felt something settle in her chest, not quite peace, but determination. Mrs. Peterson was right. She had survived worse than social disapproval and business complications. Perhaps it was time to stop protecting herself from potential hurt and start fighting for potential happiness. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Mrs. Peterson's breakfast table. Harold arrived at 7:30 with coffee from the local bakery and a determined expression that suggested he had been awake most of the night, making decisions. "I hope I am not intruding," he said, as Mrs. Peterson answered the door in her robe and slippers, "but I wanted to speak with Margot before she started work today." Mrs. Peterson's eyes sparkled with delight at this development. "Not intruding at all. Margot is just finishing breakfast. Come in, come in." Harold found Margot in the small kitchen, dressed for work but nursing a cup of coffee with the careful attention of someone who had not slept particularly well. She looked up when he entered, and the smile that crossed her face made his early morning drive worthwhile. "This is a surprise," she said. "I brought coffee, real coffee, from Sophie's bakery." He set the takeout cups on the table with the air of someone making an offering. "I thought we should talk before the day gets away from us again." Mrs. Peterson bustled around them with transparent attempts to appear busy while obviously listening to every word. Finally, Harold cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mrs. Peterson, I wonder if I might speak with Margot privately for a moment." Of course. I have some things to attend to upstairs." The older woman disappeared with barely concealed glee, leaving them alone in the small kitchen. Harold sat across from Margot at the worn wooden table, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, both aware that they had reached some kind of turning point that required decisions rather than just drift. "I have been thinking about what you said yesterday," Harold began. "About being realistic, about the complications we're facing." Margot felt her stomach clench, preparing for the gentle rejection she had been half expecting since Richard's visit highlighted how different their worlds truly were. "And I have reached a conclusion," Harold continued. "I am tired of being realistic, if realistic means choosing safety over happiness." The words were not what she had expected, and Margot felt hope flutter in her chest like a butterfly testing new wings. "What does that mean, practically speaking?" "It means I am willing to deal with Richard's disapproval and anyone else who thinks our relationship is inappropriate or ill-advised. It means I want to stop hiding what is happening between us as if it were something shameful rather than something wonderful." Harold reached across the table and took her hands, his thumbs tracing familiar patterns across her knuckles. "Margot, I am falling in love with you. I know it is fast, I know it is complicated, but I am tired of pretending that what I feel for you is anything less than life-changing." The declaration hit Margot like a physical force, stealing her breath and making her heart race with a mixture of joy and terror. Love, the word she had been afraid to even think, let alone speak aloud. "Harold, you do not have to say anything back," he said quickly. "I am not asking for declarations or promises. I am just telling you where I stand so you can make your own decisions with complete information." Margot looked into his grey eyes and saw everything she had been afraid to hope for: devotion, commitment, the willingness to fight for what they had found together. But she also saw vulnerability, the fear that came with putting your heart in someone else's hands after learning how badly such gestures could end. "I love you too," she said quietly, and watched Harold's face transform with relief and joy. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, exhilarating and terrifying all at once. But as Harold's smile lit up the small kitchen, Margot realized that some leaps of faith were worth the risk of falling. "So what do we do now?" she asked. "Now we stop sneaking around like we are doing something wrong. I want to take you to dinner in town, where people can see us. I want to introduce you to my friends as my girlfriend, not just my gardener." I want to build something real with you, something that can withstand outside pressure because we are honest about what it means to us." The proposal was both thrilling and daunting. Going public with their relationship would subject them to scrutiny and judgment from people who might not understand or approve. But it would also mean no more careful distances in professional settings. No more pretending that the most important thing in Harold's life was something to be hidden away. "What about Richard? What about your business?" "Richard will adapt, or he will not. Our partnership has survived worse disagreements than this." Harold's voice carried a confidence that suggested he had given serious thought to potential consequences. "As for the business, I've been coasting on automatic pilot for years. Maybe it is time I remembered that work should support life, not replace it." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Mrs. Peterson's deliberately heavy footsteps on the stairs, giving them warning that their private moment was ending. The older woman appeared in the kitchen doorway with poorly feigned surprise at finding them still talking. "I hope I am not interrupting anything important," she said with transparent innocence. "Actually," Harold said, standing and helping Margot to her feet, "you are the first person I would like to tell that Margot and I are officially dating." Mrs. Peterson clapped her hands together with unconcealed delight. "Oh, how wonderful! I knew it. I absolutely knew it from the moment she mentioned having dinner with someone special." "You told her about our dinner?" Harold asked Margot with amusement. "Mrs. Peterson has a talent for extracting information," Margot said diplomatically, "and a talent for keeping her mouth shut when discretion is required," Mrs. Peterson added firmly. "Though I do not suppose discretion will be necessary much longer if you are planning to be open about your relationship." "We are," Harold confirmed. "In fact, I was hoping to convince Margot to have dinner with me tonight at Romano's, where half the town will see us and the other half will hear about it by morning." Romano's was the closest thing their small town had to fine dining, the kind of place where being seen together would constitute a very public announcement of their relationship status. The suggestion made Margot's pulse quicken with nervous excitement. "I would love to," she said. "Excellent. I will make reservations for 7. Harold leaned down and kissed her cheek with gentle propriety, but the gesture felt more intimate than any of their previous kisses because it was performed without secrecy or shame. "I should let you get to work, but Margot—" "Yes, no more hiding. From today forward, we are building something together, and I want everyone to know how proud I am to be with you." After Harold left, Mrs. Peterson fixed Margot with a satisfied smile that suggested years of matchmaking experience finally bearing fruit. "That young man is absolutely smitten with you," she declared. "He is not that young. He is 48. 48 is young when you are my age, dear. And more importantly, he is in love, real love, the kind that makes a man willing to change his entire approach to life." Mrs. Peterson began clearing breakfast dishes with energetic efficiency. "You had better start thinking about what you're going to wear to dinner tonight. Romano's has standards, and you want to look like the kind of woman worthy of Harold Whitman's public devotion." As Margot drove to work, she felt as if the world had shifted on its axis overnight. Yesterday, she had been worried about complications and obstacles. Today she was Harold's girlfriend, officially and publicly, with dinner reservations that would announce their relationship to anyone who cared to pay attention. The transition from secret attraction to acknowledged love felt both natural and miraculous, like watching a garden bloom after a long winter. Romano's had been the setting for every important social occasion in their small town for 30 years. Anniversaries, business dinners, marriage proposals, and the kind of carefully orchestrated meals where reputations were made and broken over wine and carefully prepared conversations. Walking into the restaurant on Harold's arm, Margot was acutely aware that they were about to become the evening's entertainment for every diner present. Harold had arrived at Mrs. Peterson's house precisely at 7, wearing a dark suit that emphasized his height and the silver in his hair. When Margot appeared in the simple black dress she had worn to Thomas's funeral, the only formal clothing that had survived the flood damage, Harold's expression made her feel as elegant as if she were wearing designer couture. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm with old-fashioned gallantry. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." The easy exchange helped settle Margot's nerves as they drove to the restaurant, though her stomach fluttered with anticipation of the reactions they were about to face. In a town where everyone knew everyone's business, Harold Whitman dining with his gardener would provide gossip material for weeks. The restaurant was busy for a Saturday evening, filled with couples celebrating anniversaries and families marking special occasions. Margot recognized several faces from her trips to the grocery store and post office, people who knew her as the quiet widow who had moved to town 2 years ago and kept largely to herself. Their entrance created exactly the ripple of attention Margot had expected. Conversations paused mid-sentence as heads turned to take in the unlikely pair. She heard the whispered recognition, "Is that Harold Whitman? Who is the woman with him? Is not she the one who works in the flower shop?" Harold seemed completely oblivious to the scrutiny, guiding Margot to their table with the confident ease of someone accustomed to being watched and discussed. He held her chair, ordered wine with casual expertise, and maintained easy conversation as if they were dining alone rather than performing their relationship for an audience of curious townspeople. "Does this feel strange to you?" Margot asked quietly, once they had ordered their meals. "What? The restaurant? I have eaten here dozens of times." "Not the restaurant. This. Being seen together publicly, having people speculate about us." Harold considered the question while glancing around the dining room, as if seeing it through her eyes for the first time. Several other diners were making little attempt to hide their interest in the unusual pairing at table 12. "I suppose I am accustomed to being talked about," he said finally. "When you have money in a small town, people always have opinions about what you should be doing with it and whom you should be doing it with. I stopped caring about public opinion years ago." "That must be nice." "It is liberating once you realize that most criticism comes from people who have never taken the kinds of risks that make criticism relevant." Harold reached across the table to cover her hand with his. "Are you uncomfortable?" Margot looked around the restaurant, taking in the curious glances and whispered conversations. A few months ago, this level of attention would have sent her fleeing back to the safety of her anonymous apartment. But sitting here with Harold, feeling the warmth of his hand on hers and the genuine affection in his eyes, the gossip felt less threatening than irrelevant. "No," she said, surprising herself with the honesty of the answer. "I thought I would be, but I'm not. Let them talk." Harold's smile was proud and relieved in equal measure. "Good, because I plan to do this often." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a familiar figure, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the town's only female physician and someone Margot recognized from her occasional visits to the medical clinic. Dr. Mitchell was also someone Harold knew well, apparently, because he stood to greet her with obvious pleasure. "Sarah, how good to see you. How are things at the clinic?" "Busy as always. Small towns generate a surprising amount of medical drama." Dr. Mitchell's attention shifted to Margot with friendly curiosity. "I do not believe we have been properly introduced, though I recognize you from around town." "Margot Jenkins," Harold said, his voice carrying obvious pride. "I would like you to meet Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who keeps this entire town healthy and sane." "Sarah, this is Margot, my girlfriend." The word girlfriend hung in the air with the weight of a public announcement. Dr. Mitchell's eyebrows rose slightly, but her smile was genuinely warm as she extended her hand to Margot. "Wonderful to meet you properly, Margot. I've heard lovely things about your work with gardens around town. Mrs. Henderson has been raving about what you did with her rose beds." "Thank you. I love what I do. It shows." "And Harold, you look happier than I have seen you in years." Dr. Mitchell's observation was made with the directness of someone accustomed to reading people's overall health and well-being. "Whatever you two are doing, keep it up." After Dr. Mitchell returned to her own table, Margot felt some of her remaining tension ease. The doctor's easy acceptance of their relationship and obvious pleasure in Harold's happiness felt like a form of social validation she had not realized she needed. "She seems lovely," Margot said. "Sarah has been a good friend since I moved here. She was also one of the few people who told me I was being an idiot for isolating myself so completely after Sarah died." Harold paused, catching the repetition of names. "My wife, Sarah. I mean, it gets confusing sometimes. Your wife would not mind sharing a name with someone who cares about your happiness." Harold looked at her with an expression that mixed gratitude and amazement. "How do you always know exactly the right thing to say?" "Practice. I spent 21 years with someone who needed reassurance about difficult topics." The reference to her late husband brought a moment of thoughtful silence. Both of them were navigating the complex terrain of loving again after loss, learning how to honor their past relationships while building something new and separate. "Do you think they would approve?" Harold asked quietly. "Thomas and Sarah, I mean, of what we are doing?" Margot considered the question seriously, thinking about Thomas's fierce devotion to her happiness, his repeated instructions during his illness that she should not let grief prevent her from living fully. "I think," she said slowly, "they would want us to be happy. Both of them understood that love is not a finite resource. Giving your heart to someone new does not diminish what you felt for someone else." "I hope you are right." "I am right." "And Harold? I think they would like each other if they could meet. They both loved us enough to want our happiness even after they were gone." The conversation continued through dinner, ranging from serious topics to lighter subjects, but Margot was increasingly aware that they had successfully navigated their first public appearance as a couple. The initial scrutiny had given way to acceptance, and by the time they ordered dessert, the other diners had returned to their own conversations and concerns. As they prepared to leave, Harold helped Margot with her coat and kissed her cheek with natural affection, completely unconscious of the gesture's public nature. Walking through the restaurant toward the exit, Margot felt a sense of belonging she had not experienced since Thomas's death, not just to Harold, but to this community that was beginning to accept their unlikely love story. Outside in the cool evening air, Harold pulled her close for a proper kiss that tasted of wine and possibility. "How was that for our debut as an official couple?" he asked. "Perfect," Margot said, and meant it completely. The week following their public debut at Romano's settled into a rhythm that felt both new and surprisingly natural. Harold began joining Margot in the gardens each morning, ostensibly to learn more about horticulture, but really because they both craved the time together. They worked side by side, talking about everything and nothing, while the early summer flowers bloomed around them in testament to care and patience. Mrs. Peterson proved to be an ideal temporary housemate, offering motherly advice and delicious meals while maintaining a respectful distance from their developing relationship. She had also, Margot discovered, become Harold's unlikely champion in the complex social dynamics of small-town gossip. "I heard Margaret Thornton making snide comments about your relationship at the post office yesterday," Mrs. Peterson reported over breakfast one morning. "Something about gold diggers and men who should know better." Margot felt her stomach clench at the news, Margaret Thornton was one of the town's self-appointed social arbiters, a woman whose approval or disapproval could influence how others viewed any situation. "What did you say?" Harold asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I told her that anyone who spent 5 minutes watching you two together could see that Margot makes you happier than you have been in years, and that happiness is worth more than all the social propriety in the world." Mrs. Peterson's tone suggested she had delivered this observation with considerable force. "I also mentioned that people who have nothing better to do than criticize other people's love lives usually have very sad love lives of their own." "Mrs. Peterson," Margot exclaimed, though she was fighting back laughter. "Well, it is true. Margaret has been married to that dull banker for 30 years and spends her time criticizing everyone else because her own life is so devoid of passion or joy." Harold reached over and squeezed Margot's hand reassuringly. "Does it bother you, the gossip?" "Less than I expected," Margot admitted, "though I do worry about how it might affect you. Your business relationships, your standing in the community. My standing in the community is exactly what I want it to be, as someone who contributes positively and minds his own business. As for my business relationships, anyone who judges my professional capabilities based on my personal life was never worth dealing with anyway." The confidence in Harold's voice helped ease Margot's concerns, but she remained aware that not everyone would be as understanding as Dr. Mitchell or as fiercely protective as Mrs. Peterson. Small towns could be both welcoming and exclusionary, often simultaneously. That afternoon brought a test of their resolve in the form of an unexpected visitor. Margot was deadheading roses when a silver Mercedes pulled into the estate drive, disgorging an elegant woman in her 50s who surveyed the gardens with the critical eye of someone accustomed to finding fault. "Can I help you?" Margot asked, setting down her pruning shears. "I'm looking for Harold Whitman. I'm Victoria Carlyle, Richard's wife." The introduction sent a chill through Margot. If Richard disapproved of Harold's relationship with his gardener, his wife's unannounced visit suggested the disapproval was escalating into more active intervention. "Mr. Whitman is in his study. I can let him know you are here. Actually, I was hoping to speak with you first." Victoria's smile was perfectly polite and completely cold. "You are Margot Jenkins, I presume?" "Yes." "Good. I hoped we might have a little chat, woman to woman." The phrase woman to woman, delivered in Victoria's cultured tones, sounded more like a threat than an invitation to friendly conversation. Margot gestured toward the garden table where she sometimes ate lunch, and Victoria settled herself with the air of someone preparing for a negotiation. "I understand you have been seeing quite a bit of Harold lately," Victoria began without preamble. "We are dating, yes." "How charming. And tell me, what exactly do you hope to gain from this relationship?" The question was asked with such casual cruelty that Margot felt her breath catch. But she had survived worse than elegant bullies, and she was not about to be intimidated by someone who clearly viewed her as nothing more than an opportunistic threat. "I hope to gain exactly what most people hope to gain from relationships: companionship, affection, and happiness." How wonderfully romantic. But surely a practical woman like yourself has considered the more tangible benefits of attaching yourself to a man of Harold's means. "A practical woman like myself has been supporting herself since she was 18 and has no intention of stopping now," Margot replied with steel in her voice. "I was not looking for financial security when I met Harold, and I am not dating him for his money." Victoria's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose in skeptical amusement. "Of course not. But you must realize how this appears to people who have known Harold for years, a wealthy widower, still grieving his wife, taken in by the first attractive woman to pay him attention. I think you should discuss Harold's emotional state with Harold himself, rather than making assumptions," Margot said, standing to signal that the conversation was over. "And I think you should do it somewhere other than my workplace." "Your workplace?" Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Yes, I suppose that does complicate things, does it not? Sleeping with the boss can make for such awkward professional dynamics." The crude implication made Margot's temper flare, but before she could respond, Harold's voice cut across the garden with the cold authority of someone who had overheard enough. "Victoria, what a surprise. I was not expecting you." Harold strode across the lawn with the focused intensity of a man who was very much not pleased to find his business partner's wife harassing his girlfriend. Victoria rose from the garden table with fluid grace, but Margot could see tension in her shoulders that suggested she had not expected to be discovered. "Harold, darling, I was just getting acquainted with Miss Jenkins. Such a lovely conversation." "I am sure it was." Harold's tone could have frozen water. "What brings you to my home uninvited?" "Richard is concerned about you. We both are. This sudden relationship seems so unlike you, so impulsive. We worry that you are not thinking clearly." Harold moved to stand beside Margot, his presence a solid wall of support that made Victoria's elegant intimidation seem petty and ineffective. "My thinking has never been clearer," he said. "And my personal relationships are not subject to review by business associates or their wives. Harold, please, we are friends. We care about your welfare. Friends respect boundaries and trust each other's judgment. What you are doing is neither friendly nor respectful." Harold's voice remained calm, but Margot could feel the anger radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "I think you should leave now." Victoria gathered her purse with the dignity of someone who had expected this outcome, but hoped to avoid it. "I hope you will not let personal feelings interfere with business decisions, Harold. Richard values your partnership too much to see it damaged by complications." The threat was delivered with a smile, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. After Victoria's Mercedes disappeared down the drive, Harold turned to Margot with an expression of fury and apology. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea she would come here, and I certainly never expected her to confront you directly. She thinks I am after your money. Victoria thinks everyone is after something. It is how she views the world." Harold pulled Margot into his arms, holding her close enough that she could feel his heart racing with residual anger. "What she thinks does not matter. What matters is what we know to be true." The confrontation with Victoria Carlyle proved to be only the beginning of a campaign designed to pressure Harold into reconsidering his relationship choices. Over the following days, a series of seemingly coincidental encounters and conversations made it clear that Richard and Victoria were mobilizing their social and business networks to create obstacles for the unlikely couple. First came the casual business dinner invitation that arrived by special messenger, requesting Harold's immediate presence at an exclusive restaurant 2 hours away to discuss urgent matters with potential investors. The dinner was scheduled for the same evening Harold and Margot had planned to attend the town's annual summer festival together. "You should go," Margot said, when Harold showed her the invitation, though disappointment was evident in her voice. "Business is important. Business is what I do to support the life I want to live," Harold replied, setting the invitation aside without a second glance. "The life I want to live includes summer festivals with you." The next pressure came in the form of Dr. James Morrison, Harold's longtime physician, who happened to stop by the estate with concerns about Harold's recent behavior changes. Dr. Morrison was a good man who genuinely cared about his patient's welfare, which made his visit more difficult to dismiss than Victoria's obvious manipulation. "I have been hearing things around town," Dr. Morrison said, as he and Harold sat in the study, "about sudden lifestyle changes, new relationships. I wanted to check in, make sure you are feeling stable emotionally." Harold appreciated the doctor's concern while recognizing the orchestrated nature of his visit. I am feeling better than I have in years, Jim. The relationship you are referring to is the best thing that has happened to me since Sarah died. But is it wise to make major life changes so quickly? You have been isolated for years, then suddenly you are involved with someone significantly younger, someone from a very different background. Someone, Harold interrupted, who makes me remember what it feels like to be alive. Jim, I understand your concern, but I am not having a midlife crisis or suffering from impaired judgment. I am falling in love with an extraordinary woman who happens to challenge my previous assumptions about compatibility and social conventions. Dr. Morrison left still worried, but unable to identify any concrete symptoms of mental or emotional instability. Harold was clearly happier and more engaged with life than he had been during his years of self-imposed isolation. The third attack came through Margot's professional life, Mrs. Henderson, whose rose garden Margot had transformed from disaster to showcase, called to cancel their weekly maintenance contract with profuse apologies and obvious discomfort. "I am so sorry, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, unable to meet Margot's eyes. "It is just that my husband thinks—" "Well, he has heard things about your personal situation, and he feels it would be inappropriate to continue our business relationship." Similar calls followed throughout the week. Not everyone cancelled their contracts. Dr. Mitchell actually increased her order for office arrangements in a gesture of pointed support, but enough clients withdrew their business to create genuine financial pressure. "They are trying to force you to choose between your relationship with me and your livelihood," Harold said grimly when Margot reported the latest cancellation. "This is exactly the kind of manipulative behavior I should have expected from Richard." "Maybe they are right to be concerned," Margot said quietly. "Maybe I am affecting your judgment, your business relationships, your standing in the community." Harold turned from the window where he had been staring out at the gardens they had worked together to create. "Margot, do you trust me?" "Of course." "Then trust me when I say that my judgment has never been clearer. Yes, loving you has changed my priorities. Yes, it has made me less willing to tolerate people who think social status is more important than human connection. But those are positive changes, not evidence of impaired thinking." Despite Harold's reassurances, the pressure was taking its toll on both of them. Margot found herself second-guessing their public displays of affection, wondering if holding hands at the grocery store or sharing a kiss goodnight in front of Mrs. Peterson's house was providing ammunition for their critics. Harold became more protective and defiant, which sometimes made social situations feel like battlegrounds rather than pleasant outings. The situation reached a crisis point when Richard himself arrived at the estate on a Friday afternoon with an ultimatum disguised as a business proposal. Margot was working in the herb garden when she heard raised voices from Harold's study, not the usual tones of business discussion, but the sharp edge of fundamental disagreement. "This is your last chance to be reasonable," Richard's voice carried through the open windows. "Walk away from this ridiculous relationship, or I walk away from our partnership." "Then walk away." Harold's reply was immediate and uncompromising. "If you think my personal happiness is negotiable, then you never understood what kind of partnership I wanted in the first place." "Harold, think about what you are saying. We have built something significant together. Are you really willing to throw that away for a gardener? I am willing to throw it away rather than let you dictate my personal life. And Richard, her name is Margot. If you cannot bring yourself to use it, then you are not the kind of person I want to do business with anyway." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the outcome was never in doubt. Richard left the estate in a fury of screeching tires and slamming doors, while Harold emerged from the house looking both relieved and shaken. "That sounded serious," Margot said as he approached her workspace. "Richard has withdrawn from our partnership, effective immediately." Harold's voice was steady, but she could see the cost of the decision in his eyes. We will have to restructure several ongoing projects, and there will be financial implications, but it is done. Harold, you cannot sacrifice your business for me. It is too much, too important. It is not a sacrifice if I get something better in return. Harold knelt beside her in the herb garden, his expensive clothes forgotten in the dirt. Margot, I would rather build a smaller, more honest business on my own than continue partnering with someone who thinks love is a liability. That evening, as they sat on Mrs. Peterson's front porch watching the sunset, Margot tried to process the magnitude of what Harold had done. He had ended a 15-year business partnership rather than compromise their relationship, a gesture that was both romantic and terrifying in its implications. "Are you sure you will not regret this?" she asked. "The only thing I would regret is letting fear and other people's expectations prevent me from choosing happiness." Harold took her hand, intertwining their fingers with practiced ease. "I spent 4 years playing it safe, Margot. Safe is overrated. But what if we do not work out? What if this thing between us does not last?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. "Then at least I will have tried. At least I will have chosen love over convenience, passion over safety. I can live with the possibility of heartbreak. I cannot live with the certainty of emptiness." As the last light faded from the sky, Margot leaned against Harold's shoulder and tried to believe that love really could conquer the practical obstacles arrayed against them. But she could not shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. The crisis that shattered their careful optimism came not from external pressure, but from an unexpected source that neither Harold nor Margot had considered. 3 weeks after Richard's ultimatum and departure, Mrs. Peterson answered her phone to news that would change everything. "That was my nephew Jake," she announced, hanging up with an expression of barely controlled panic. "There has been an accident at the flower shop. The building inspector found structural damage from the water leak that is much worse than we thought. The entire building has been condemned." Margot felt the blood drain from her face. "Condemned? The foundation is compromised. The building is not safe for occupancy until major repairs can be completed, and the insurance company is refusing to cover the full cost because they claim the damage existed before the pipe burst." Mrs. Peterson sank into her kitchen chair with the weight of someone receiving devastating news. "I do not have the money for that kind of reconstruction, Margot. I'm going to have to sell the property to a developer." The implications hit Margot like physical blows. No flower shop meant no supplemental income from arrangements and consultations. No apartment meant no affordable housing. No Mrs. Peterson's spare room meant no temporary housing, since the older woman would have to move in with relatives while she figured out her own future. "How long do we have?" Margot asked, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. 2 weeks. Maybe 3 if the lawyer can negotiate extensions." Harold, who had arrived for dinner just as the news was delivered, immediately stepped forward with the solution that seemed obvious to him but impossible to Margot. "You will move in with me," he said without hesitation. "Both of you, if necessary. The house has plenty of space, and this is clearly a temporary crisis that just needs time to resolve." Mrs. Peterson looked touched by the offer, but Margot felt panic rising in her chest like floodwater. Moving in with Harold after 3 months of dating would transform their relationship from romantic exploration to committed cohabitation, a step that felt premature and dangerous given the pressures they were already facing. "Harold, that is incredibly generous, but I cannot just move into your house. We have not even discussed living together, and with everything that is happening with your business, What is happening with my business is that I am restructuring it to better reflect my values and priorities. Having you close by during that process would be a gift, not a burden. But even as Harold spoke, Margot could see the complications multiplying like weeds in her mental garden. Richard and Victoria would view her moving into Harold's house as confirmation of their worst suspicions about gold diggers and manipulative relationships. The town gossips would have a field day with the live-in gardener who had seduced her wealthy employer. And most dangerously, the financial dependency such an arrangement implied would fundamentally alter the balance of power in their relationship. "I need to think about this," Margot said, feeling trapped between impossible options. "Of course, take all the time you need." But Harold's voice carried hurt and confusion at her hesitation to accept what seemed like an obvious solution. That night, lying in Mrs. Peterson's spare bed for what might be one of the last times, Margot stared at the ceiling and tried to find a path forward that did not require sacrificing either her independence or her relationship with Harold. But every option seemed to lead to compromise that would fundamentally change who she was or what they meant to each other. The next morning brought additional bad news. 3 more clients cancelled their gardening contracts, citing various excuses that all pointed to the same underlying issue. Association with Margot was becoming socially problematic for people who cared about maintaining their standing in the community's complex hierarchy. "I am becoming radioactive," Margot told Harold, as they walked through the gardens that might soon be her only remaining source of income. "People are afraid that being seen to support me will somehow associate them with whatever scandal they think we represent. Then they are cowards and fools, and you are better off without their business." "Harold, I cannot afford to be better off without their business. I have lost more than half my client base in 3 weeks. Even if I keep this job with you, I cannot support myself on one income source." The practical reality hung between them like a storm cloud. Without the flower shop income and the supplemental gardening contracts, Margot could not afford to maintain her independence, could not afford her own housing or the kind of financial autonomy that had always been essential to her sense of self. "Let me help," Harold said quietly. "Let me hire you for additional projects, or increase your salary, or—" "No." The word came out sharper than Margot intended, but the suggestion felt like a step onto a slippery slope that ended with her becoming a kept woman rather than an equal partner. "Harold, I appreciate the impulse, but I cannot let you solve my financial problems." "It would change everything between us." "How?" "Because then I would be dependent on you in a way that would make it impossible to know whether I was staying because I loved you or because I needed you. And you would never be sure whether I was with you for yourself or for your ability to provide security." Harold was quiet for a long moment, processing the distinction she was making between love and need, between partnership and dependency. Finally, he nodded with the reluctant understanding of someone who had seen relationships destroyed by exactly the kind of financial imbalance she was trying to avoid. "So what do we do?" Margot had been asking herself the same question since Mrs. Peterson's devastating phone call, and she was beginning to reach a conclusion that broke her heart even as it felt increasingly inevitable. "I think," she said slowly, "I need to leave town. Start over somewhere else, where my reputation is not complicated by our relationship, where I can rebuild my client base without dragging you into ongoing social drama." The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and hurt that spread outward in expanding circles. "You want to leave?" Harold's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the pain underneath. "I do not want to leave. I have to leave. Harold, I love you, but I cannot build a relationship on the foundation of financial dependence and social exile. I need to be able to support myself, to contribute equally to whatever we build together. Right now, Staying here means watching you sacrifice your business relationships and social standing while I become increasingly dependent on your support. What if I do not care about business relationships and social standing? You should care. You have worked too hard to build what you have to watch it crumble because of gossip and small-minded prejudice. Margot reached for his hands, holding them tightly as if she could convey through touch what words seemed inadequate to express. I love you enough to protect you from the consequences of loving me. Harold pulled away from her touch, his grey eyes bright with unshed tears. That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. I do not need protection from loving you. I need protection from losing you. But even as he spoke, Margot could see him beginning to understand the terrible logic of her position. Their love had become a liability that threatened to destroy the very qualities that had made them attractive to each other in the first place. Her independence, his success, their ability to choose each other freely rather than from desperation or necessity. Standing in the garden where they had fallen in love, surrounded by flowers that bloomed because of their combined care and attention, they faced the possibility that sometimes love was not enough to overcome the practical obstacles that life placed in its path. The silence that followed Margot's declaration stretched between them like a chasm neither knew how to bridge. Harold stared at the roses they had pruned together that morning, their bright blooms seeming to mock the idea that care and attention always led to flourishing outcomes. "When?" he asked finally, his voice hollow. "I have been looking at opportunities in other states. There is a position with a landscaping company in Oregon that seems promising. They need someone with experience in residential design, and the cost of living is reasonable enough that I could afford my own place while I build up a client base." The specificity of her research hit Harold like a physical blow. While he had been focusing on ways to make their relationship work despite the obstacles, Margot had been quietly planning her escape route. The realization that she had been considering leaving without telling him felt like a betrayal, even though he understood the practical thinking behind it. "Oregon," he repeated numbly, 3,000 miles away. "I know how it sounds, but Harold, what choice do I have? Stay here and watch you sacrifice everything you have built for a relationship that may not survive the pressure. Accept your financial help and become the kind of dependent partner I swore I would never be. Keep losing clients until I have nothing left to offer anyone." Harold wanted to argue with her logic, to insist that love could overcome practical obstacles if they just tried hard enough. But standing in the garden where their romance had bloomed, he could see the damage that the past month had inflicted on both of them. Margot had grown tense and defensive, constantly braced for the next attack on their relationship. He had become protective to the point of aggression, ready to fight anyone who questioned their choices. They were becoming people they did not recognize, and not in positive ways. "There has to be another solution," he said. But even he could hear the desperation in his voice. "Maybe there is, but I cannot see it from here, where every day brings new complications and new reasons for people to disapprove of us." Margot's voice cracked slightly, revealing the cost of the decision she was contemplating. "Harold, I need space to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by being your girlfriend or the woman who is causing problems in your life." The admission that she felt defined by their relationship rather than enhanced by it struck Harold as profoundly wrong. Margot had been extraordinary before he ever spoke to her, skilled, independent, strong enough to rebuild her life after devastating loss. If loving him was making her feel diminished rather than celebrated, then something was fundamentally broken in how they were handling the external pressures. "What if we both left?" The words came out before Harold had fully formed the thought, but once spoken, they felt like the first sensible thing either of them had said. What if we started over somewhere new, together but separately? You could establish your business, I could restructure mine, and we could explore our relationship without the weight of everyone else's expectations. Margot stared at him as if he had suggested they relocate to the moon. You cannot just abandon your life here. This house, your connections, everything you have built. Everything I have built has been in service of a life I thought I wanted, but did not actually enjoy living. The house is beautiful, but it has felt like a museum more than a home until you started working in these gardens. My connections have proven to be conditional on my conforming to their expectations of appropriate behavior. Harold moved closer to her, hope beginning to flicker in his chest like a candle sheltered from wind. Margot, what if this crisis is not the end of something good, but the beginning of something better? Harold, you are not thinking clearly. You cannot make major life decisions based on a relationship that is only a few months old. I am not making decisions based on our relationship. I am making decisions based on what I have learned about myself since our relationship began. Harold's voice grew stronger as the idea took shape in his mind. I have learned that I prefer working with my hands to sitting in boardrooms. I have learned that I care more about creating beauty than accumulating wealth. I have learned that the opinions of people like Richard and Victoria matter less to me than the opinion of Mrs. Peterson and Dr. Mitchell. Margot felt herself wavering, caught between the practical voice in her head that catalogued all the ways this could go wrong and the hopeful voice in her heart that whispered about possibilities she had not dared to consider. Where would we go? What would we do? Anywhere you want. Oregon, if that is where you have been looking. I could start a consulting business focused on sustainable development. You could build the kind of landscaping practice you have always dreamed of. We could buy a house with enough land for proper gardens and enough distance from small-town gossip to build our relationship without constant scrutiny. The vision Harold was painting felt both impossible and irresistible. Margot tried to imagine it. A new place where she was not the widow who had caused a scandal, where Harold was not the millionaire who had lost his mind over the hired help. A place where they could be simply two people who had found each other and were trying to build something meaningful together. It would be a huge risk, she said, but her voice had lost the flat certainty of someone who had already made up her mind. The biggest risk would be staying here and letting other people's fear and prejudice poison what we have found together. Harold reached for her hands again, and this time she did not pull away. Margot, I love you. Not because you are convenient or comfortable or socially appropriate, but because you are brave and honest and capable of finding beauty in the most unlikely places. I want to spend my life creating beautiful things with you, whether that is gardens or a home or a completely different kind of future than either of us had planned. The declaration was both romantic and practical, addressing her fears about dependency while acknowledging the magnitude of what he was proposing. But as Margot looked into Harold's grey eyes, she saw something that had been missing from their relationship during the recent weeks of external pressure: peace. For the first time in a month, Harold looked like the man who had nervously asked her to dinner, the man who had spent 17 YouTube videos learning to cook chicken marsala because he wanted to impress her. You would really be willing to leave all of this? She asked, gesturing at the beautiful house and manicured grounds that represented years of careful investment and planning. I would be willing to leave anything that prevents me from being happy with you. Harold's answer was immediate and certain. This house is just a building without the people who make it feel like home. These gardens are just plants without someone who tends them with love. Everything that matters to me could be recreated anywhere, as long as you are there to help create it. The simplicity of his logic cut through the complex web of fears and practical concerns that had been paralyzing Margot for weeks. Perhaps the solution was not to fight the obstacles that surrounded them here, but to remove themselves from the battlefield entirely. Perhaps love did not always require standing and fighting. Sometimes it required the wisdom to know when to start fresh. Oregon has a long growing season, she said quietly, and the soil is supposed to be excellent for roses. Harold's smile was like sunrise after a long night. Is that a yes? It is a maybe, a serious maybe. Margot felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. But Harold, if we do this, we do it as partners, equal partners. I pay my own way, make my own decisions, contribute equally to whatever we build together. I would not want it any other way. Standing in the garden where their love had taken root, they began to plan an entirely different kind of future than either had imagined possible. The decision to leave together transformed the crisis that had seemed insurmountable into a series of manageable logistics. Within days, Harold and Margot were researching Oregon communities, comparing property values, and discussing the practical steps required to relocate their lives across the country. The energy that had been consumed by defending their relationship against external criticism was redirected toward building their shared future. Mrs. Peterson proved to be their most enthusiastic supporter, treating their decision to start over together as a romantic adventure worthy of celebration rather than a retreat from local pressure. "Oregon is beautiful this time of year," she announced over breakfast, having spent the previous evening researching their potential destination online. "And Salem has a wonderful farmers market where Margot could sell arrangements while she builds up her landscaping clientele." "You have been researching Salem?" Margot asked with amusement. "Of course I have. If I am going to lose my two favorite people to the West Coast, I want to make sure they are landing somewhere worthy of them." Mrs. Peterson's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Besides, I may be old, but I am not dead. A road trip to visit you in Oregon sounds like exactly the kind of adventure I need." Harold had been working with quiet efficiency to untangle his business obligations and prepare for the move. The process of liquidating his partnership with Richard had revealed just how much his priorities had shifted over the past few months. Deals that had once seemed essential now felt like distractions from the life he actually wanted to live. "I spoke with a real estate agent in Salem yesterday," he told Margot as they walked through the gardens one morning. "She has several properties that might work for us, houses with enough land for serious gardening, but close enough to town for business development." "Houses, plural," Margot noted. "Harold, we have not discussed living arrangements." "I meant what I said about maintaining my independence." Harold paused in his examination of a climbing rose that was showing signs of aphid damage. "I have been thinking about that. What if we bought properties near each other rather than together, close enough to share daily life, but separate enough to maintain our individual space and autonomy?" The suggestion was so perfectly calibrated to address Margot's concerns about dependency that she wondered if he had been listening to her fears more carefully than she had realized. "That could work," she said slowly. "As long as we are clear that this is not about hedging our bets or planning for failure. It is about building success, about creating a foundation strong enough to support whatever our relationship becomes without either of us sacrificing the independence that makes us who we are." Their conversations were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Mitchell, who had requested a private meeting to discuss their plans. The physician's visit was friendly rather than confrontational, but Margot sensed an agenda beneath the social pleasantries. "I wanted to talk to both of you before you make any final decisions about leaving," Dr. Mitchell said, as they settled in Harold's study with coffee and homemade cookies she had brought from the bakery. "Not to discourage you, but to make sure you are not running away from something that could be resolved with time and patience." "What do you mean?" Harold asked. "I mean that small-town attitudes change more quickly than people expect, especially when the people involved handle themselves with dignity and grace. You two have weathered the initial storm of gossip and criticism. If you stay and continue conducting yourselves with the same integrity you have shown so far, the community will eventually accept your relationship as normal rather than scandalous." Dr. Mitchell's observation carried the weight of someone who had lived in the town long enough to witness several cycles of social drama and resolution. But Margot felt compelled to address the practical concerns that transcended social acceptance. "Even if the gossip dies down, I have lost too many clients to rebuild my business here effectively, and Harold has burned bridges with his business partner that may affect his professional opportunities. Have you considered that those losses might open doors to better opportunities?" Dr. Mitchell asked. "Harold, you have been talking for years about wanting to focus on more sustainable, community-oriented projects. This disruption might force you to pursue work that aligns better with your values. And Margot, the clients you have lost were clearly not the kind of people you want to work with anyway. The clients who have remained loyal, like myself, will recommend you to others who share their values." The doctor's perspective offered a different way of viewing their recent struggles, framing setbacks as opportunities for growth rather than evidence of inevitable failure. But Harold found himself still drawn to the fresh start that Oregon represented. "Those are valid points," he said, "but I think we have both realized that we want to build something new together, not just repair what has been damaged here. The relationship we have discovered with each other has shown us possibilities we had not considered before." Dr. Mitchell nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen many patients navigate major life transitions. "In that case, I wish you both happiness and success, but I also want you to know that you will be missed here, and that you will always have a home to return to if Oregon does not prove to be everything you hope." After Dr. Mitchell left, Harold and Margot spent the afternoon planning their departure timeline. The house would need to be prepared for sale or rental, the gardens would need arrangements for ongoing care, and Mrs. Peterson would need help organizing her own transition to temporary housing with relatives. "I keep expecting to feel more anxious about this," Margot said as they sat on the front steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "Leaving everything familiar behind should be terrifying, but it is not. It is exciting. For the first time since Thomas died, I'm looking forward to the future instead of just trying to survive the present." She leaned against Harold's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "What about you? Any second thoughts about abandoning your carefully ordered life?" Harold considered the question seriously, looking out at the estate that had been his sanctuary and his prison in equal measure. "I keep thinking about what you said when we first had dinner together, about beauty requiring patience and care. I have been patient with grief and careful with safety, but I have not been patient or careful with joy. Oregon feels like a chance to tend happiness the way you tend gardens, with attention and commitment and the willingness to keep trying even when things get difficult." "Exactly." Harold turned to kiss her temple, a gesture so natural and tender that it felt like a promise. "Are you ready for that kind of challenge?" Margot smiled, thinking about the roses they had pruned together, the meals they had shared, the conversations that had revealed depths in both of them they had not known existed. "I think we have been training for it all along." As the last light faded from the sky, they sat together planning the details of their shared adventure, two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances, preparing to build an entirely new life from the foundation of that unexpected gift. The process of preparing to leave revealed how much their lives had become intertwined with the small community they were abandoning. Every day brought reminders of connections they had not fully appreciated until the prospect of severing them became real. Harold discovered that his morning coffee runs to Sophie's bakery had become part of the social fabric of the town, and Sophie herself seemed genuinely distressed by the news of his departure. "Who is going to buy my experimental pastries?" she demanded when Harold stopped by to settle his account. "You are the only customer brave enough to try new recipes without complaining when they do not work out perfectly. I am sure you will find other adventurous customers," Harold assured her, touched by the unexpected personal connection he had developed with the baker without quite realizing it was happening. "It will not be the same. You and Margot have good hearts. People will figure that out eventually, but apparently not soon enough to keep you here." Similar conversations played out across town as word of their departure spread. Mrs. Rodriguez from the hardware store expressed regret that she would lose Margot's business just as spring planting season was approaching. The librarian mentioned that Harold had been one of her most thoughtful patrons, always returning books exactly on time and occasionally leaving anonymous donations for the children's reading program. These interactions highlighted something that both Harold and Margot had been too focused on their critics to notice. They had supporters in the community, people who valued their contributions and would miss their presence. The realization was both gratifying and bittersweet, confirmation that they could have built a life here if circumstances had been different. Mrs. Peterson threw herself into helping with their preparations with the energy of someone determined to send them off properly. She researched moving companies, compiled lists of essential services they would need in Oregon, and began planning a farewell dinner that threatened to include half the town. "You cannot leave without a proper send-off," she declared, when Harold suggested that a quiet departure might be easier for everyone. "People need closure, and you need to leave with your heads held high, not slinking away like you have done something wrong." The farewell dinner became a defining moment that revealed the true complexity of their situation. Dr. Mitchell and her husband attended, along with Sophie from the bakery, Mrs. Rodriguez, the librarian, and several other townspeople who had supported them throughout the recent difficulties. But conspicuously absent were the social arbiters like Margaret Thornton and the business associates who had aligned themselves with Richard Carlyle's campaign of disapproval. The evening felt like a gentle validation of their choices. The people who attended were those who valued authenticity over social convention, kindness over status, genuine connection over appearance management. Sitting at Mrs. Peterson's dining room table, surrounded by well-wishers who had brought homemade dishes and heartfelt good wishes, Harold and Margot understood that they were not fleeing in defeat, but graduating to a larger stage where their values could flourish more freely. "I have something for you, Doctor," Mitchell announced as the evening wound down, presenting them with a carefully wrapped package. "A housewarming gift for your new home, wherever that may be." Inside was a beautiful cutting from her prized heirloom rosebush, carefully prepared for transport and replanting. "This variety has been in my family for 3 generations, she explained. "It should do well in Oregon's climate, and it will give you a living connection to the friendships you are leaving behind here." The gift was both practical and symbolic, a reminder that the best aspects of their current life could be transplanted and would flourish in new soil with proper care and attention. Harold's preparations involved more complex logistics as he worked to close down his local business operations and transition clients to other professionals. The process revealed how much his approach to work had changed since meeting Margot. Projects that had once excited him now felt routine and uninspiring, while opportunities he had previously dismissed as too small or unconventional began to seem appealing. I have been thinking about your idea of focusing on sustainable development, Margot said as they reviewed Harold's business transition plans. What if you started with our own property in Oregon, designed something that could serve as a demonstration project for the kind of work you want to do? The suggestion sparked an enthusiasm in Harold that confirmed how much his professional priorities had shifted. A showcase for sustainable design integrated with serious landscaping, something that proves environmental responsibility and aesthetic beauty are not mutually exclusive. Exactly. And if it works, if we create something beautiful together, it becomes the foundation for both of our new businesses. Your consulting work and my landscaping practice, developed in partnership but maintaining our individual identities. The concept felt like a perfect synthesis of their respective skills and shared values. Harold had the business experience and financial resources to support ambitious projects, while Margot had the horticultural expertise and artistic vision to create landscapes that enhanced rather than competed with architectural design. Working together without either being dependent on the other represented the kind of partnership they had been struggling to define. Their final week in town was marked by a series of small rituals that felt like formal goodbyes to the life they were leaving behind. Harold donated his remaining business library to the local college, keeping only the books that reflected his evolving interests in sustainable design and community development. Margot carefully transplanted cuttings from her favorite plants in the estate gardens, creating a portable collection that would connect their new home to the place where their love had taken root. The estate itself would be maintained by a caretaking service until Harold decided whether to sell or keep it as a potential retreat. The gardens would be tended by a local landscaping company that Margot had recommended, ensuring that the beauty they had created together would survive their departure. On their last evening, they walked through the gardens one final time, remembering the conversations that had taken place among these flowers, the gradual courtship that had unfolded along these paths. The roses were blooming magnificently, testament to the care and attention they had received, and Margot felt a mother's pride in leaving them healthy and thriving. "Do you think we will miss this place?" Harold asked as they stood beside the rose bush where he had first worked alongside her, learning to deadhead spent blooms. "I think we will miss the version of ourselves we discovered here," Margot replied. "But I am excited to see who we become in Oregon." Harold pulled her close, holding her in the garden where they had fallen in love, surrounded by the flowers that had witnessed their journey from attraction to commitment, to the courage required for new beginnings. "Whatever we become, we will become it together." The promise carried the weight of everything they had learned about love and loss, independence and partnership, the difference between safe choices and right choices. Tomorrow, they would begin the drive to Oregon, carrying with them the lessons learned in this small town and the unshakable conviction that some risks are worth taking for the chance at extraordinary happiness. Standing among the roses in the fading light, they were already planning the gardens they would plant together in their new home. The morning of their departure dawned clear and bright, as if the weather itself was offering encouragement for their bold venture into the unknown. Harold loaded the last of their belongings into the moving truck, while Margot secured the precious plant cuttings that would make the cross-country journey in climate-controlled comfort in the back seat of her pickup truck. Mrs. Peterson insisted on preparing a breakfast that could feed a small army, muttering about the inadequacy of highway food and the importance of proper nutrition during stressful transitions. She bustled around her kitchen with determined cheer, but Harold noticed the way she kept glancing at Margot when she thought no one was looking, memorizing details like a mother preparing to send a child off to college. "You have my phone number? My email address?" And my promise that the guest room will always be ready for visits," Mrs. Peterson announced as they finished their meal. "Oregon is not the moon. We can maintain a friendship across any distance if we make the effort." "We will make the effort," Margot promised, embracing the older woman who had become like family during her time of transition. "And you better keep that promise about the road trip. I want to show you the gardens we create." Dr. Mitchell arrived just as they were completing their final preparations, carrying a thermos of coffee and a manila envelope that she pressed into Harold's hands. "Letters of recommendation for both of you," she explained. "Professional references that focus on your character and work ethic rather than local gossip. You may need them as you establish yourselves in a new community." The thoughtfulness of the gesture reminded them once again that their departure was not an escape from universal hostility, but a strategic retreat from a specific set of circumstances that had made their happiness more difficult than it needed to be. The actual moment of leaving proved less dramatic than either had anticipated. They had said their meaningful goodbyes over the past week, completed their logistical preparations with military precision, and reached a state of emotional readiness that made the physical departure feel like a natural next step rather than a traumatic rupture. Harold drove the moving truck, while Margot followed in her pickup, their convoy representing everything they owned and everyone they were choosing to become. The symbolism was not lost on either of them. They were traveling together but separately, maintaining their individual agency while committing to a shared destination. The first day of driving took them through familiar countryside before transitioning into regions neither had visited before. Harold found himself paying attention to landscape features and architectural styles with new eyes, seeing potential inspiration for the sustainable design work he hoped to develop. Margot noticed soil conditions and native plant communities, already planning how to adapt her gardening expertise to different climatic conditions. They stopped for lunch at a small-town diner in Ohio, sitting across from each other in a vinyl booth and marveling at how normal their adventure felt now that it was actually underway. The decision that had seemed so momentous in planning had resolved into a series of highway miles and practical details. "Any regrets so far?" Harold asked, as they shared a piece of apple pie that reminded them both of Mrs. Peterson's baking. "Only that we did not do this sooner," Margot replied. "I keep thinking about all the energy we spent trying to make other people comfortable with our choices, instead of focusing on what made us comfortable with our choices." The observation captured something essential about their recent experience. They had allowed external disapproval to overshadow their own knowledge of what felt right and healthy about their relationship. Leaving town was not just about finding better circumstances, it was about reclaiming their right to define their own happiness. Their second day of travel took them through Illinois and Iowa, landscapes that reminded Margot of her grandmother's farm and filled her with nostalgia for the agricultural rhythms she had grown up understanding. Harold found himself charmed by the small towns they passed through, communities that seemed to balance growth with preservation in ways that aligned with his evolving professional interests. "Look at that," Margot said, as they stopped for gas in a town that had transformed its abandoned railroad depot into a community garden center. "Someone figured out how to honor the past while adapting to present needs." The example sparked a conversation about the kind of community they hoped to find in Oregon, the balance between fitting in and standing out that would allow them to build satisfying lives without repeating the social complications they were leaving behind. By the third day, they had developed a rhythm that felt sustainable for the remaining distance. Morning departures after leisurely breakfasts, regular check-ins via cell phone during driving segments, shared meals that became opportunities to process the day's observations and plan the next phase of their journey. Harold discovered that he was enjoying the physical act of driving more than he had expected. The moving truck required more attention and skill than his usual luxury sedan, and the challenge of managing the large vehicle through mountain passes and construction zones provided a welcome distraction from the magnitude of the life changes they were implementing. Margot found herself energized by the changing landscapes visible from her truck windows. Each new region offered different growing conditions, different design challenges, different possibilities for the landscaping business she hoped to establish. The plant cuttings in her back seat were thriving despite the travel stress, an encouraging sign for their ability to adapt to new environments. The fourth day brought them into Colorado, where mountain vistas provided the first dramatic preview of the western landscape they were choosing as their new home. The scale and beauty of the scenery reminded them both of why they had been willing to risk everything for the chance at a more expansive life. "I had forgotten how big the country is," Harold said during one of their phone conversations as they navigated winding mountain roads. "How many different ways there are to live, how many different communities where we could build the kind of life we want. Do you think we would have been brave enough to try this if circumstances had not forced our hand?" Margot asked. "I do not know, but I am grateful that we found the courage, whatever the source." Their fifth and final day of travel brought them across the Utah desert and into Oregon, where green valleys and distant mountains promised the kind of landscape that had drawn them westward. The town of Salem appeared in the late afternoon, spread across rolling hills that reminded Margot of the countryside around her grandmother's farm, and Harold of the sustainable communities he had visited during business trips to California. As they pulled into the parking lot of the hotel where they would stay while house hunting, both felt a sense of arrival that transcended mere geography. They had completed more than a cross-country move. They had successfully navigated the transition from a relationship tested by external pressure to a partnership strong enough to support major life changes. Sitting in the hotel restaurant that evening, sharing a bottle of Oregon wine and planning their first day of property hunting, Harold and Margot felt like pioneers who had reached the territory where they could finally build the life they had been imagining together. "To new beginnings," Harold said, raising his glass in the toast that had become their ritual. "To choosing courage over comfort," Margot replied, clinking her glass against his with the satisfaction of someone who had kept a promise to herself. 6 months after their arrival in Oregon, Harold and Margot had transformed from refugees fleeing small-town pressure into pioneers creating exactly the kind of life they had dreamed of during their cross-country journey. The properties they had purchased, a sprawling farmhouse for Margot and a smaller cottage for Harold, separated by a shared meadow and connected by walking paths, had become the foundation for both their romantic partnership and their professional collaboration. Margot's landscaping business had grown from a single client to a waiting list of homeowners eager for her sustainable garden designs. Her approach, which emphasized native plants and water conservation while maintaining beauty and functionality, had found an enthusiastic audience in environmentally conscious Oregon communities. The portfolio of projects she was developing would have been impossible in her previous location, where traditional formality was valued over innovative ecology. Harold's transition to sustainable development consulting had proven even more successful than he had dared to hope. His first project, the renovation of their own properties using green building techniques and integrated landscape design, had attracted attention from architects and builders throughout the region. The demonstration of what was possible when environmental responsibility and aesthetic beauty worked in harmony had become a marketing tool more effective than any traditional advertising. Working together on their shared property had revealed new dimensions of their compatibility. Harold's analytical approach to problem-solving complemented Margot's intuitive understanding of how living systems functioned, creating solutions neither could have developed independently. Their morning conferences in the meadow between their houses had become legendary among their local colleagues for generating innovative approaches to complex design challenges. "I have been thinking about the Morrison project," Margot said one morning as they shared coffee and planning time in Harold's kitchen. The Morrison project was an ambitious residential development that wanted to incorporate significant green space and sustainable building practices, their largest potential contract to date. What specifically? What if we proposed a phased approach that demonstrates different levels of environmental integration? Start with one section using conventional methods as a baseline, then escalate through increasingly sophisticated sustainable techniques in subsequent phases. Harold paused in his review of architectural drawings to consider her suggestion. That would provide concrete comparison data and give buyers options across different price points. Plus, it addresses their concern about market acceptance of unfamiliar approaches. Exactly. And it creates opportunities for education and community engagement that could influence demand for similar projects in other developments. The ease of their professional collaboration continued to surprise both of them. Harold brought business development skills and financial resources, while Margot contributed technical expertise and creative vision. But more importantly, they had learned to challenge each other's assumptions and build on each other's strengths without either feeling diminished or overshadowed. Their personal relationship had flourished in parallel with their professional partnership. Living in separate but connected spaces had proven ideal for maintaining their individual identities while sharing daily life. Harold could retreat to his cottage when he needed quiet time for complex planning, while Margot could spread her design work across her farmhouse kitchen table without worrying about disrupting his schedule. Yet, they could also share meals, evening walks, and lazy Sunday mornings without anyone feeling crowded or constrained. The social acceptance they had found in Oregon felt almost miraculous after their struggles in their previous town. Their neighbors included other transplants from various parts of the country, artists and professionals, and retirees who had chosen the area for its beauty and community spirit rather than social conformity. Harold and Margot's romance was viewed as a lovely story rather than a scandalous development, and their professional partnership was seen as an innovative approach to sustainable living rather than evidence of questionable judgment. "Mrs. Peterson called yesterday," Margot reported as they walked through the vegetable garden she had established behind her farmhouse. "She wants to visit in August when the roses are in full bloom." "How is she adjusting to living with her sister?" "Better than expected. Apparently her nephew Jake has been helping her plan a small flower shop in her sister's town, something she can manage without the overhead of building ownership." Margot stopped to examine tomato plants that were showing promising signs of early fruit development. "She sounds happier than she has in years, actually. Like our adventure inspired her to try some new adventures of her own." The news about Mrs. Peterson's own reinvention felt like confirmation that their decision to leave had been beneficial for everyone involved. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do was remove yourself from situations that were not working, creating space for new possibilities to develop. Dr. Mitchell had also reported positive developments in their former town. Richard Carlisle's increasingly isolated position in the business community had led to several failed ventures, and the departure of other partners who had grown tired of his rigid approach to relationships and opportunities. Harold's former clients had begun seeking out professionals who shared his values-based approach to development, creating a market niche that had not existed when he was too focused on conventional success to notice emerging demand. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had stayed and fought it out," Harold mused, as they completed their evening walk through the property that had become their shared laboratory for sustainable living. "We would have won eventually," Margot said with quiet confidence, "but we would have become different people in the process. Harder, more defensive, more focused on proving ourselves right than on building something beautiful. And you prefer who we are becoming here?" Margot looked around at the gardens they had created together, the businesses they were building, the community they were joining as full partners rather than controversial outsiders. "I prefer who we were brave enough to become when we stopped letting other people define what was possible for us." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar pickup truck in their shared driveway. Jake Peterson emerged carrying a large cooler and a grin that suggested good news. "Special delivery from Aunt Ruth," he announced, lifting the cooler with obvious effort. "She said you needed proper care packages now that you are living in the wilderness." Inside the cooler were dozens of Mrs. Peterson's famous cookies, several jars of her homemade preserves, and a carefully wrapped cutting from the rosebush that had grown outside her condemned flower shop. A note attached to the cutting read, "For the garden where your love story continues to bloom." She also wanted me to tell you that Margaret Thornton asked for your address, Jake added with obvious amusement. "Apparently, her daughter is getting married next summer and wants to hire someone who can design gardens that work with the environment instead of fighting it." The irony of their former critics seeking their services was both satisfying and instructive. Public opinion had indeed shifted in their absence, but they were no longer dependent on that approval for their happiness or success. As Jake departed with messages of love and best wishes to carry back to Mrs. Peterson, Harold and Margot stood in their shared meadow, watching the sunset paint the Oregon sky in shades of rose and gold. They had traveled far more than 3,000 miles from the estate where they had fallen in love. They had journeyed from fear to courage, from defensive positioning to creative partnership, from hoping they could make their relationship work to knowing they had built something strong enough to support whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. 1 year after their arrival in Oregon, Harold and Margot stood in the same meadow where they had shared countless morning conversations, but this time they were not alone. 30 guests had gathered to witness their wedding ceremony, a celebration that reflected the journey they had traveled together and the community they had built around their love. Mrs. Peterson sat in the front row, beaming with the satisfaction of someone whose matchmaking instincts had been spectacularly vindicated. She had arrived 3 days earlier to oversee the wedding preparations with the focused intensity of a general planning a military campaign. Determined that everything should be perfect for the couple, she considered her greatest success story. Dr. Mitchell had flown in from their former town, bringing news of continued positive changes in their old community and serving as Harold's best woman in a ceremony that honored their friendship and her role in encouraging them to trust their hearts over social expectations. Jake Peterson had driven across country with a truck full of flowers from his aunt's new shop, creating arrangements that combined Oregon natives with cuttings from the gardens they had left behind. The ceremony itself was simple and personal, officiated by a local minister who had become their friend and incorporating vows they had written to reflect their specific journey from employer and employee to equal partners in love and life. Harold's vows focused on Margot's courage in choosing authenticity over approval, while Margot spoke to Harold's willingness to risk security for the chance at genuine happiness. "When I first watched you working in my gardens," Harold said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his grey eyes, "I was drawn to your skill and dedication. But what made me fall in love with you was your willingness to find beauty in unlikely places and your refusal to compromise your values for the sake of convenience." "When you first asked me to dinner," Margot replied, her brown eyes bright with tears of joy, "I was terrified of risking my independence for the possibility of love. But you have shown me that true partnership enhances rather than diminishes who we are individually, and that some risks are not really risks at all. They are investments in the people we are brave enough to become. The reception took place in the garden they had created together over the past year, a demonstration of their combined talents that had become a pilgrimage site for other couples seeking to integrate sustainable living with aesthetic beauty. Tables were arranged among flower beds that showcased native Oregon plants while incorporating elements from their previous gardens, creating a living testament to the possibility of honoring the past while embracing new growth. As the sun set over their celebration, Harold and Margot found themselves momentarily alone in the vegetable garden, where they had spent so many mornings planning their shared future. The sounds of laughter and conversation drifted from the reception, but in this quiet space, surrounded by plants they had chosen and tended together, they could appreciate the magnitude of what they had accomplished. "Do you ever miss the drama?" Margot asked, referring to the conflicts and complications that had driven them from their previous life. "The intensity of fighting for our relationship against external opposition." Harold considered the question while looking out at the garden that represented months of collaboration and shared vision. "I miss the clarity that opposition provided, the way external pressure made our choices feel more significant. But I prefer the peace that comes from building something together rather than defending it against attack. Even when peace feels less romantic than conflict. Especially then, anyone can sustain passion during crisis. It takes real love to maintain connection during ordinary happiness." The observation captured something essential about the evolution of their relationship. The dramatic intensity of their early courtship, heightened by external pressure and social disapproval, had given way to the deeper satisfaction of daily partnership and shared creation. They had learned to find romance in morning planning sessions and evening garden walks, in the small gestures of consideration that sustained long-term relationships more effectively than grand romantic gestures. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Dr. Mitchell, who had been observing the celebration with the satisfaction of someone who had correctly diagnosed what her friends needed for optimal health and happiness. "I have a confession to make," she announced, as she joined them among the tomato plants that were heavy with late summer fruit. "I knew you two would end up together before either of you figured it out." "How could you possibly have known that?" Harold asked with amusement. "Because I watched how you both changed after Margot started working here. Harold became more engaged with life, more interested in his surroundings, more willing to try new things. Margot started taking better care of herself, paying attention to her appearance, humming while she worked. You were both exhibiting classic symptoms of people falling in love, even during your carefully professional phase." "Why did you not say anything?" Margot asked. "Because the best relationships are the ones people discover for themselves, rather than having pointed out to them. You needed to figure out that you were compatible partners before you could become successful lovers." Dr. Mitchell's analysis reminded them of how much they had grown both individually and together since that first nervous dinner conversation. They had progressed from attraction to affection to genuine partnership, learning to navigate challenges and celebrate successes as a team rather than as separate individuals trying to coordinate their efforts. As the evening wound down and their guests began making their departure plans, Harold and Margot walked through the property that had become the foundation for their shared life. The cottage and farmhouse stood in comfortable proximity, connected by paths that represented their individual autonomy and shared commitment. The gardens they had created together demonstrated the possibility of combining different approaches and perspectives to create something more beautiful than either could have achieved alone. "What do you think comes next?" Margot asked as they paused beside the rose garden that incorporated cuttings from Dr. Mitchell's heritage bush, Mrs. Peterson's rescued flower shop, and their former estate. More of the same, I hope. More projects that challenge us professionally, more mornings working together in the garden, more evenings planning adventures we want to share. Harold pulled her close, marveling at how natural it felt to hold his wife in the space they had created together. Maybe some travel to visit friends and explore new ideas for our work. Maybe some time to mentor other couples who are trying to build relationships that honor both individual identity and partnership. That sounds like a wonderful life. It sounds like our life. Standing in their garden under the Oregon stars, surrounded by flowers that bloomed because of their combined care and attention, Harold and Margot understood that they had accomplished something more significant than a successful cross-country move or a thriving business partnership. They had proven that love could overcome practical obstacles when two people were willing to choose courage over comfort, partnership over independence, and authentic happiness over social approval. The roses around them released their evening fragrance into the cooling air, a reminder that beauty requires patience and care, but rewards those who are willing to tend it with devotion and hope. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.